Todd has just said he can't hear anything. Should be able to.
Oh, Todd, can you hear us?
All right. Yes, sorry about that, Commissioners. I've just managed to get my system set up now so I can hear you. I wasn't hearing you before.
Okay, and I recognise that home office from some other hearings, so welcome.
Thank you.
Yes. So this is the reconvened hearing 22 rezoning and report back day for us in terms of the Kuitai Court author's verbal right of reply. And but before we do that, we did have, well, I had a couple of questions for Megan about the Hill Airport rezoning. You provided some evidence to us, Megan, and you weren't available on Monday, was it, when we heard it? So we did just want to test with you a couple of issues around this site. So Christina, we could have that site up there. So you're familiar with this plan?
Yes.
And you're familiar with the new airport tribe designation that has now been, we made a decision on it. So we had some questions about whether that's being confirmed by the council and whether there's an appeal period running or not. You don't know?
No, we don't. Todd will talk about this in his writing reply.
Okay.
Sure.
You don't know. Okay. But that's likely to be the new road arrangement here. And I think road one on that plan there, Megan, the Parklands Drive, which is planned to go all the way through.
Correct, yeah, keeps up with that block to the west.
Block to the west, yes. So the main issue we need to confirm is that seeing a commercial area there, is there a potential traffic solution for access to that site from Airport Drive? Or is your advice that it's going to be very difficult? Or what is your advice in a summary term?
My advice is that when further detail on what type of commercial area is known about that site, then there could be a solution to having a on Airport Drive.
Yes.
But it's not until I would be able to understand how that site is going to be used and the type of commercial uses on there. For example, if that is a driveway into a petrol station, then I do not support that driveway in that location. However, if that is a driveway to the back of house or some of the servicing for some of those sites that has a very low trip generation rate, then a left in, left out arrangement could potentially be made to work there. But given the brand new roundabout that will be very close to it, that will provide a significantly safer operation for vehicle movements getting to and from that commercial area than a driveway just north of the roundabout.
Okay. So hypothetically, if there was a supermarket, sorry, a service station and maybe some associated shops, you see these ones around that have a cafe on the side or a Coles or a Subway or something, you know, the ones.
Yeah.
Only left out on Airport Drive. Would that still be a concern with you?
I wouldn't support that if that was for the general traffic accessing that site. It could still have very high chip generation rates. And with the shared paths going to be along that side of Airport Drive, connecting significant amount of area Q up to the coastal walkway, I don't think that's a good fit for that type of driveway in that location. I've talked about that, the safety concerns that accompany that in my evidence.
What about access from Road 1?
I think you could make that work for the commercial area. I think you could make that work. It's going to be a slower speed environment than what Airport Drive is. And I think if it's designed appropriately with the scale of that development, you could make an access along there work.
Okay. And you could even have potentially on the details of the planning, there's still possible to have some sort of like service access or something coming out.
It would have to be, yeah, it would
And
have
I
to
presume it would need to be as far off the plan
be correct.
as possible.
Yes, as far away from the roundabout as possible. And again, yeah, it would have to have very low vehicle movements using that driveway.
See that little white box where Airport Drive is written towards the top of the blue area there?
Yes,
You know what that is?
I believe that's the location that they thought for the driveway. Is that
Right.
correct? That's my understanding.
Yes.
That's not it.
And we have some scope issues, Megan, because the original mission thought 4,000 square metres of land,
Okay,
and this latest survey plan filled up the area because the roundabouts come slightly down towards the initial structure plan had this in a slightly different place, this section.
Yeah.
So they filled that in and then extended this is the submitters, extended the commercial area towards those two that we can see there
okay,
as well. So we've got a range of options in terms of, our deliberation decision on the site.
okay.
But to me, knowing a little bit about these traffic matters that we've heard lots about in various hearings, there are safe distances in and around roundabouts.
Correct.
And roundabouts tend to have a, even though I don't know what the speed limit through that future road would be, but traffic is not travelling that fast in and out of roundabouts.
That's correct, because the geometry of the roundabout, to slow down to make those corners, ideally it's sort of by the time you're negotiating the roundabout, you're driving around 30 kilometres per hour from our designed roundabout. But as soon as you leave that roundabout, you're obviously accelerating. So it does make it quite tricky, in fact, when you put a driveway near a roundabout for vehicles entering and exiting the driveway to anticipate the speed of the oncoming vehicles,
Yes.
because they're essentially
Coming
accelerating
down,
towards
yes.
you. Yeah, so it's as far away from the roundabout as possible, or alternatively, and in this case, in an ideal situation, you'd make the most of those other frontages and have the driveway off the low speed roads.
Thank you. Kit, did you have any other questions for Megan?
There's a rule at the moment which you've quoted in your evidence that makes any vehicle access onto Airport Drive discretionary. So the zoning per se wouldn't alter that. Any proposal to develop there would need to get a discretionary consent. And if, for example, hypothetically, you were engaged by the applicant and were asked to provide a traffic assessment, you would obviously ask them, what's the mix of your tenancies? What's the likely trip generation? You'd look at the fact that the speed environment on Airport Drive, you know the roundabout's already there. You'd give some recommendations about what's the best way to lay out the accesses at that time as part of that resource consent, wouldn't you?
You would, yes.
Yeah. And one of the pieces of advice might be stay away from Airport Drive. You've got enough frontage on what will be Parklands Ave. You want to have a dedicated in and a dedicated out, so that if people can come in that way and not have to use Airport Drive. And you'd potentially give that advice to the landowner, wouldn't you? Yeah. And you'd organise your accesses that way. So I don't know, I guess I'm still a bit bemused as to why, knowing that that is the potential future pathway for any accesses around Airport Drive, why not knowing what each tenant is going to be makes it impossible for you to say that the zoning is not appropriate.
Yeah. I don't believe I said the zoning was not appropriate. I believe I said that without knowing the detail of how that site would work, it's hard to say whether that driveway could be made safe.
But isn't that something that would be dealt with at the resource consent process? And your advice might be, look, it's just not a safe place to have an exit. So I'm going to advise you as part of this application to stay away from Airport Drive.
That's true. I think there's very few scenarios where that driveway would be a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I tend to agree with you, but it doesn't. But the fact that it's possibly not a good idea doesn't really. Well, it's a factor, but I'm not sure whether it's a critical one in determining what the appropriate zoning would be. But that's just my sort of thinking at the moment. I'm interested. We had a brief chat the other day when you weren't here about whether there was a control under the transport rules as to the distance from a roundabout that you could have an access or an exit point on a side road. And I think the comment was, there is a rule, but no one knows where to measure it from. So I made a note that I was going to ask you about it. Are you familiar with this control about the?
So typically the way that so Austroads provides guidance on how you measure that. And you take the straight line down Airport Drive and
The
it
middle of the
provides,
road?
no, the curb line.
Curb
Take the curb line down Airport Drive and
You can get up and show us if you like.
Yeah. This won't help Todd, but I'll work to the screen.
Yeah.
You take the curb line down Airport Drive.
Yeah.
And you take Parklands Avenue where it connects, and it connects at a point here,
Yeah.
and then you measure that distance.
Oh, I see.
So
Okay.
those two
All right.
curb lines bisect.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a bit unusual with a roundabout. It's not clear like a
Okay.
nice.
And do you know what the
road.
distance? Do you know what the distance in the plan is?
No.
Okay.
For an arterial, it's different to a collector, which is different to a local road.
Okay. What's the current status of Airport Drive? It's
Arterial.
arterial, and will it stay as that after? Okay.
In Parklands, what would be a collector?
Yeah. Okay.
And so would be good for us to know if, what those distances are. Maybe if you perhaps provide a note to us.
Would we find that in the transport chapter?
Well, yeah. The reason I'm asking this is so important is that if we only, if the decision was to say go 4,000 metres, cut in half, is there enough space on Parkland Road 1 there to provide an access clear of the roundabout? Because if you cut in half, for example, if you take the,
Well, I mean, that assumes you cut it that way. You could cut it the other way to some extent, but and then you end up with a commercial centre with houses right on the back of it to some extent. Yeah. But
okay.
yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
So it might be easier if you just give us that.
Okay.
I send us an email by Christine. That'd be great.
And it's the site distance requirements
Yeah.
from an intersection
Yeah,
to an
new-
access way.
New vehicle crossing
Or-
distance.
For arterials and collectors.
Commissioners, can I just make a comment?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think just one of the matters that this traffic issue has really been part of the district plan review process is that, as well as the zoning provision which the submitter is seeking, they are also seeking a change to the notified policy P3 in the structure plan provisions. And I'll just read that out because it's in part of Aaron Edwards' original evidence to the earlier structure plan hearing, because they are seeking a change to the policy. So the policy at the moment reads, manage the number and location of vehicle access points onto Airport Drive and Devon Road, State Highway 3 within the Bow Block Area Q structure plan development area to ensure, and then it's got point 1 and then point 2 is a key one here where they are seeking a change. Point 2 of the notified version of the plan is, so it's new vehicle access points to Airport Drive north of Parklands Avenue are avoided as far as practicable. So that's directly relevant to the submitter's zone request, and they have actually sought a change to that policy to provide some additional provision, which I can just read out It's from Aaron's evidence. So we've got that avoid as far as practicable, and then they're requesting after that, except that a new vehicle access point to service the local centre zone shall be appropriately managed to ensure the safety and efficiency and the sustainable management of the road network. So I just wanted to highlight that to the commissioners, that part of the submission is a request to change the policy for access onto Airport Road. So I just wanted to highlight that so it's in the commissioner's mind. And again, that's one of the reasons why we elected to bring in Megan's evidence, because we did consider that it was a policy issue that we needed to consider as well.
Thank you, Todd, for that additional piece of advice. So I think Megan, you can just give us those side distances. Do you have any other questions? Thank you for attending this morning. Guess it wasn't too early to.
No. Thank you.
Thank you, good to see you again.
Sorry, just one more. Ellie, are you going to talk about the road discussion?
Because we haven't heard from Rosie, I wasn't going to give a verbal.
I wanted to Megan should say.
Oh, right.
We do have some
Okay, well, maybe.
questions about road.
Sorry.
Yes, Rosie.
You're still waiting back, there's still some work to do, isn't there?
We're yet to hear from Roe Devon, so Hayden Bryant and Jeremy Brophy. They'll be allocated a slot at the Blue Haven hearing to talk about the Devon websites.
Oh, okay. So you
So
were
we've
up
been
next, so
preempted.
shall we deal with that? Yeah, you're up next.
I am, yes.
But I don't think we're in a position for you to give a verbal reply on that,
No.
because you haven't heard the outcome of that discussion with NZTA and Jeremy Brophy and everything.
Yes.
That's right. So it'd be uncomfortable to give a verbal reply, but happy to answer questions that you might have. They don't lead me too much.
I did have a question pending that evidence. Let's call this, there's 3 sites in that area. We've got the Blue Haven site, we've got the Hemblin property, so New Zealand Couriers, and Big Barrel, and then we've got that Broke Devon, which is the 6 or so properties to the north, I suppose. There is, and this is something maybe prepare for Monday on, you're suggesting mixed use for the Broke Devon site at the moment, based around some sort of traffic solution. We've got a process in place to perhaps think about that. Mr. Bronis is doing the hearing on the other side of Perry Road, and he's recommended to us that the Hamlin site, those 2 properties, 2 shops stay as general industrial.
Yes.
So we certainly are interested in that whole area from a traffic perspective, some sort of integrated advice in relation to those three blocks of land, I suppose. So that's just really a heads up, because the traffic implications all around it are obviously all interrelated.
Yes, I had anticipated you would want to talk about them collectively.
Yes.
At the hearing next week.
And is Megan advising the council in terms of the issues around the Broke Devon side and meeting with Whakatei and okay, right. That's all I just wanted to flag that as a integrated area of land that we think traffic issues are very integrated most of those 3 blocks of land. Thank you. David's what says?
Oh, I'm going to say I'm concerned that Broke Devon have not been income. I don't know whether we put a time frame around that, but we made it very clear to Broke Devon representative that this is an opportunity to discuss those matters and bring his planning consultant on board. That was a week ago now.
Yes, and
And I'm not, it's not a criticism of you
oh, no,
at all. All I'm saying is that time is marching on,
yes.
and I wonder for you, Mr. Chair, whether you're able to reach out and perhaps encourage that to happen sooner rather than
Right,
later.
I did meet with them yesterday and with Wakakotahi as well. So we've had that roundtable discussion that you requested of us to see if we could find some common ground. And it was a very useful exercise in understanding one another's position, and particularly for Jeremy and for Aidan Bryant, Pro Devon, to understand Wakakotahi's concerns. They're waiting to be advised of a slot that they can come and speak to you. But
That will be next Monday, Tuesday.
yes, so they haven't been heard. It's unorthodox, isn't it? But
Okay, so when I made that comment, I didn't realise that you'd had an initial, basing it on the fact you hadn't heard from, you said you hadn't heard from them. I didn't realise that you'd had a round table yesterday.
yes, sorry, they haven't been allocated a slot at the hearing yet. That's as I understand it.
I understand that, but I thought you said that you had
Oh,
not heard from
I'm
them.
sorry, but you're wrong there.
So there was a round table yesterday and a general discussion.
Yes. General discussion around the zoning options, the potential for a bit more of a forensic approach to the provisions and looking at some site-specific approach there. But there still is a gap between the parties in terms of information and desire for information, understanding what a comprehensive development might look like on that site.
Is that gap largely around traffic impact, safety and efficiency?
It is. It is the
Probably as far as.
Well, you can lead a horse to water. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't being critical of you.
Do we have a timetable for next Monday, Tuesday yet?
We've got, I don't think we've seen the timetable.
I'll check with Julie.
Yeah. It's going to be a busy couple of days.
I suspect it's probably better for them to be slotted after we've heard from Blue Haven, as a before the right of reply, usually, so possibly on Tuesday.
Yes.
I don't know, it's just thinking, otherwise they'll go before Blue Haven.
On the floor, on Tuesday, if you want me to zoom in.
Oh, of course, because this is,
Designation,
so you could zoom on Tuesday.
possibly zoom on Tuesday.
Christine, can we get that program sorted out today before, with Eve recognising that we prefer Pro Devon issues to come to us as a discrete slot on Tuesday before the officers right of fly, and then advise us all, including Dave, from the next program forward.
Julie's back about, she's hoping about 3 o'clock
Okay.
on their website.
And probably might be a 4 o'clock stop for me because I'm getting off to Auckland and then Asia. So,
Okay,
yeah, it'd be a hard stop when you get the plane.
Tuesday morning before the.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Dave. Right, I think we're back on track. We're getting to probably stage left now.
Thanks, Nick.
Right, let's go with that. Thank you, Ali.
Right. Well, aside from that, that matter, the Pro Devon submission, we really received very few submissions on general industrial zoning. And it really only leaves the submissions from Kāinga Ora for me to cover up with you today. And so these are 3 small areas of general industrial zoning dotted around the city, one of which I recommended in favour of Kāinga Ora's position that it be rezoned to mixed use. And that is the site on the corner of Seaview Road and Devon Street West. So Christine will bring it up. It's currently occupied by a number of motor vehicle servicing type activities.
That's the corner of State Highway 45 and CQ.
It is, yes, at Lynmouth. It's in a sort of dip there. There's a tree house.
What do you call it?
Lynmouth. Lynmouth.
LYN mouth.
Yeah.
Okay. Hate to ask these things.
Lynmouth.
Lynmouth?
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Sounds funny, doesn't
It does.
it? Lynmouth.
Right, so this is the collection of sites, and Mr. Ray in his evidence, it was clear that he hadn't recognised that I'd recommended in favour of their position, and that I agree that this area should be of mixed use zone. So to my mind, that's not a matter of contention anymore. We can put that to one side, which leaves the remaining two sites that two areas rather that Kāinga are interested in rezoning to mixed use. One is the sites at Niger Terrace and Hobson Street in the central city. This is where the council has its parks department located, and there are several sort of engineering type businesses on Niger Terrace. And also the area of the sites in behind the shops at Strandon. So this is the internal set of sites that currently house industrial activities, including Atapai Industries, which is a business that provides employment to people with disabilities. So that was background, because I'm sure you've visited these sites at least in a cursory sense. So Mr. Ray's only comment on those areas was that he saw that they were close to centres and therefore geospatially well located to transition to mixed-use activities. You would have read in my report, my view is that these long-established small industrial areas are operating really well in their environments, and in fact they provide a level of public benefit in providing those employment opportunities where there are good transport links and walkable. So really there was no evidence presented from Kāinga to convince me, at least, to alter my recommendations on those two areas of industrial zoning. I do see from perhaps from a textbook point of view, and if we didn't have any established activities there, that they do look unusual. A little bit of purple shading in there, but as I say, I think they're really part of a well-functioning urban environment.
Yeah, changing it to mixed use wouldn't change that, but I mean, I didn't sit on the mixed use hearing. What do you see would be the critical difference from an enablement of a change of use that the mixed use would deliver for those sites?
Well, me, the worry that I have is that you have an existing industry there, a genuine industrial activity, and I am thinking here of Atapai Industries, and I am thinking of the council's Parks Depot. And my concern is that if we do zone to mixed use, looking ahead to the future, we restrict those activities to a reliance on existing use rights, which is quite different from the enablement of a zoning.
But couldn't they operate under the zone provisions on mixed use?
Mixed use. Well, they could operate through existing use.
Yeah.
As soon as they wanted to alter their hours or what have you, mixed use industrial activities are discretionary. So yeah, you would be triggering that.
Talking about Hobson and Niger Terrace here, aren't you?
Yes.
Yes, when I'm talking about the parks sites, yes. I also think that the Strandon situation, that I wouldn't see that transitioning to mixed use at all. I would see probably the market demand would be more in the residential space, and that and and that you wouldn't even go through a mixed use zoning to get to that point. I think we'll probably see or we may see, that residential pressure come on, and those industrial sites may be gobbled up that way. Right in the middle of Strandon, which is a popular area, and also that the sites don't have any interface with the street, so they're not ideal for mixed use activities with low visibility.
That's what that's almost an island in the middle of that block,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it
With a
is,
series
yeah.
of driveways to it, yeah.
Yeah, you wouldn't even notice it was there.
No one thought that it become residential.
No, but I was curious that Kāinga Ora hadn't.
The mixed use zone, unless the residential living overlay, which has been developed, applies, would make residential activity in the mixed use zone discretionary or restricted.
So it's discretionary in the mixed use zone generally.
Yep.
But in that living precinct, it
Yep.
would drop to restricted discretionary.
So that sort of gives it a favourable.
For the current activities around standard shops, alley and those industrial zones.
Yes, on the adjacent sites against Devon Street are shops.
Yes.
The adjacent sites to the rear are residential.
Okay, there's an industrial spot from there.
Yes.
Well, what are their current activities?
As I said, there's Artify Industries, which is
Okay.
that's the predominant use of that area. They've got a very large warehouse space and big yard.
You put the aerial on, Christine, go to Strandon.
I have got a list of the other activities. I haven't got it on me, but this was Strandon.
Yeah, Strandon.
Yes, so this was the address.
Devon Street.
Yes.
Yeah, Devon Street,
Yeah.
just opposite Kofi Street. Yeah, that one. Okay. No, you can see it right there.
Yeah. Take the transparency down.
Put it up, sorry.
Take the zone map off. And just so they can see the aerial.
Yeah.
Clean up there. Yes.
Yeah, so I would call it sort of light industrial. There's warehousing, and then there's that big area to the east is the Artify Industry.
The other one. Yes, yes. I've got questions on all three sites. Just going back to the one that you've recommended was change from general residential to, general industrial to general.
To mixed use.
Mixed use, sorry. Mixed use. The limits, sorry. This is a recommendation that has been, is this a recommendation that's been altered since the 42 report, or was it? No, it was part of the 42. And in terms of the section 32 AA required for that change, have you relied on the Kāinga Ora assessment, or you provided your own rather generic one?
Yes, it is quite brief. Isn't it?
Yes. I'm just looking for a little bit more in your right of reply, which might draw on Kāinga Ora's. Clearly, it seems uncontentious. There were no further submissions, I think, opposing the Kāinga Ora position, were there?
No, there weren't. And it perhaps is a little bit of catch up to this zoning because with the definition of commercial activity is new
Yes.
to the plan. And this traditionally may have been thought of as light industrial, but actually the activities now fall within the new definition.
That's fine. A little bit more analysis will be useful when you write a
Yes,
reply.
yes.
And you don't need to reinvent the wheel, I'm sure it's
Picking that
there with Quaint or.
Thank you.
Moving on to the, so Niger and Thompson. Are there any further submissions in opposition to the Quaint? I can't remember from Hamlet 42A in front of me.
We received original submissions from the landowners of the Niger Terrace site, number 4, I think, supporting the notified zoning of industrial. So these are industrial operators in that area wanting to retain their industrial zone.
Was that Artify or was that someone else?
No, this is, I'm not sure what they're called, but they've got a scaffolding business, they've got industrial workshop. I think I mentioned that the boys' high school make use of.
Yes, but their original submission was in support of this general industrial zone.
Correct, yes, that's right.
And that was the only one.
Yes, so that landowner, I'm just checking for you that. And Kang order further submitted on that submission.
Opposing it.
Yeah, opposing it. And the submission from Kang order to rezone to mixed use was supported in part by Brodeven and Mike Ekdahl and Neil and Susan Drought. So these are all landowners of other sites around New Plymouth that were similarly.
Yes, it's all coming back to you now.
Yes.
Okay. And it's the entirety of the zone, it's the entirety of the purple area that was subject to the zone, or submission. Thank you.
So which bit is it? Because there's a little purple block down on Niger Terrace.
Yes.
Is it that one or is it the bigger one?
Councils.
The big one that's currently highlighted is the council's park
Okay.
stepper. On Niger Terrace, the eastern half of that is the submitters. And the-
Scaffolding.
yeah, the scaffolding, and then the remainder is, I think, council warehousing for the Wicklow Park lights.
Oh, yeah, okay. The general residential site to the west seems to be co-opted into sort of industrial sorts
Oh,
of
that-
uses as well.
Yes, that little, there's a little dwelling, is this what you're talking about? On Hobson Street?
No, I'm talking Niger Terrace.
Oh, Niger
Yeah,
Terrace.
just to the left of the purple. See, it's general res, it looks like a landscaping yard or some sort of business.
Is this the one that's been
Wanting to
currently?
adjust the boundary.
Yes, yeah, I think there's a subdivision proposed for that.
So
site.
which is the piece, does Canmore receive the whole lot,
Yes,
both purple blocks?
yes, both purple blocks.
Sorry then.
Here's the council's, which is the council's park depot. It's the big one you're seeing here
Yes.
at the top with the zebra stripes on. And what are the activities on that little block on Niger Terrace?
The-
The small blob of purple.
On Niger Terrace, that's what I've just described. So we
Yes,
have,
but what are the activities on there?
there's a scaffolding.
Oh, that's where the
business
scaffold.
And the warehouse.
That's in the open space zone, is it? The warehouse?
The warehouse is on the, is in
Oh, I get you.
the purple, in the industrial zone, and then there's a, there's a club there on the corner.
Bridge Club. It does seem an odd spot zone, that one. Just recognising a current use right beside a residential.
Yes, yes, yes.
No one sought the removal of, apart from Quaint, or the removal of that industrial spot zoning.
No, as I say, the landowners are keen for it to remain industrial.
just carrying on, I think what would be really useful for me, want to do a site visit to both Hobson, Nodger and Devon, but in your right of reply, you think you could annotate the map to show the landowner boundaries in relation to the zoning? That would be really useful. And I noticed that the black and white dotted line that shows the parcel that Christine's got up there. Obviously, there's part of that parcel of land that's not an industrial, out to the east. Is there a cadastral boundary through there, or is that? Look, that would suggest that's one parcel, wouldn't it?
Does, doesn't it? Yes, I can have a little bit of title. See what colour.
Yes. What's on? Like this heavily vegetated.
It does, yes, it's stream. It's a stream through there and there is
Cemetery. Yeah.
a.
But again, no
temporary
one's
cemetery.
sought an extension of the industrial zoning over that land, have they?
No.
Moving on to Strandon. Same sort of situation. Quangora seeking change there to mixed use zoning. You've expressed some surprise about maybe they could have suggested general residential.
Yes, yes, I think that would give a stronger case in my view.
We're looking just at the two planning maps, comparing Hobson, Nodger and Strandon. Yes, the one thing and advantage of Strandon is that it is the general industrial zone is surrounded by mixed use in this location where it's not in Hobson and Nodger. Is that a factor that you've taken into consideration in your recommendation?
Well, yes, I mean, I did look at all the surrounding zonings, of course, and in the Hobson Niger situation, it's a real mix, isn't it?
Yes.
And in here we've got that typical sort of centre zoning where there is mixed use and it goes along to local centre now, town centre. With this little bit of industrial zoning that's operating quite nicely.
Yes. So the same questions I put to you on Hobson Niger. So KO lodged an original submission seeking the rezoning for that entirety of the block.
Yes.
Did that attract any further submissions
The same further submissions as
from the landowners? From
the same further submissions in support from the Bro Devon and
okay, yes.
those ones, but there were no other further submissions. No further submissions.
And were there any other original submissions?
No.
Again, just in terms of the land ownership and your right to reply, that would be useful, just factual information. That was all from me on those three.
No? Good, Ali?
Oh, so you were going to talk about the Wakakotahi matter, that's no longer in contention. The Devon Road property that they was a rezoning, and your it was a rezoning to mixed use, I think. You covered off in your speaking notes last week. This was a rezoning.
Oh,
was
yes,
it
this is-
why
Yeah, this is the sites adjacent to Blue Haven.
Yeah.
So we're still yet to hear from Bro Devon.
all of those.
Yes.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Very much, Ali. Right, we now move into Joe. And let's have episode. Morning.
So I think where we probably came up quite clearly yesterday that the zoning of reserve is the biggest issue. In regards to my report, I went away and sought some help from the lead of the planning and design team, who's an expert in the reserve Reserves Act. We talked it through and she's given me some documentation about the fact that really we would have to do a Reserves Act process prior to a rezoning. And the reason for that is because we would have to go out for a public consultation to do any kind of amendment or revocation of a reserve status. And there are limitations to that as well. We could, there was a amendment in the Reserves Act Delegations Act in 2013 that allows the council as the administrating authority to do some of these things itself, but there's still quite a long process which has sort of 6 steps to it. I'll just quickly take you through those. So we would have to consult with the commissioner, DOC obviously. We would have to resolve to change the classification or purpose of a reserve, and that would have to go through the council. We would have to publicly notify that resolution and the reason for doing so for 1 month, and then consider submissions from anybody claiming to be affected. And any person who does not lodge an objection is deemed to have assented to the proposal. So that's a plus. But we would then have to confirm or revoke that resolution and then publish the confirmed reserve change in the Gazette. It's quite a long process. And obviously the rezoning would have to wait for that because obviously we wouldn't know quite what the feedback would be. And that's just for some types of reserve. There's actually statutory limitations to changing scenic, nature or scientific reserves or historic reserves. And they just actually can't be made unless there's been a destruction or other like cause, to the reserve. So we're very much hamstrung by that Reserves Act process in order to rezone. I'm aware that it would seem to be on the face of it 2 different processes, and it is obviously, but we do have to comply with both of those. So that's the constraint, and it is a timing constraint as well, and it's a process. There's an order of process that we would have to take into account. That's very frustrating because it would seem to be counterintuitive that you couldn't rezone a reserve that was made a historic reserve because it's important to Māori. It is sort of counterintuitive to my way of thinking, but unfortunately that's the process, that's where we stand. And I did indicate in my Section 42A report that we would be prepared to enter into that kind of process, the dual process, to do the rezoning potentially. But for instance, there are a couple of historic reserves that have been requested to be rezoned, and it doesn't look to me as if we can do those at all. Looking at that, we'd have to go to the minister, we'd have to get permission, and it would be a very large and costly process. So we are effectively hamstrung by the need to comply with the Reserves Act.
Can I just ask, you said you've been advised by, you name the person, that you need to revise the reserve status first, and I'm just wondering whether that's because the law says thou shalt not rezone until you've changed the reserve status, or simply because the nature of the process that is involved to change the reserve status is complex, time-consuming, and potentially might not even yield a change, that it's just not wise to rezone first.
That's correct. It's the latter.
There's nothing stopping us from rezoning, but we may potentially end up in a position, if you go down the path of trying to change the reserve status and it's not successful, that you've got a Clayton's zoning. And so it's a question of efficiency and practicality, isn't it?
Are all those reserve areas open space zone at the moment? Do they have a zoning?
The variety, most of them are open space, I think. There are some that do have rural production, but not very often. In fact, one was, there was a reserve area in the industrial zone. But mostly they are open space of some straight or other.
Where I struggle, Joe, is that if they've got a rural production zone, or open space zone, or industrial zone, why can't they have a married purpose zone? There's nothing to say they can't.
Look, I agree.
The Reserves Act doesn't say to us, this is Kit's question, thou shalt not, thou shall zone all reserves open space, that they are discrete processes.
Yeah.
So we're not barred from doing it.
No, but as the council, because we have to comply with both acts, we feel like we would have to make sure those acts work together and
You have to uplift the reserves.
that's right, either to revoke the reserve status or change it to local purpose, which doesn't require all of that process to take place. And that's why we can do the rezoning on Te Rewa Reserve, which has a local purpose status, and the other Trimble Park, the part of, because they have local purpose status.
I think the commissioners are all on the same page. We all understand the revocation, reclassification process. What we're not understanding is that that is a prerequisite to rezoning. It's not. No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
And so, if I just finish, I think it's important in your right of reply that you record that, because that's a little bit of different advice from what you've said in your 42A. We understand that it's a complex process, and from an effectiveness and efficiency process, you might not want to rezone if there's no appetite to go through that process to reclassify, revoke, but that's not an issue for us. It's an issue for the council. We have to treat the merits of the rezoning on the merits.
It's not so much that we wouldn't want to do it, because I've signalled in my report, my section 42, we would be prepared to do it. But the issue is, if the public consultation process does not support the, a rezoning or a different use of that land, and we do have to take account of the uses of the
So
land.
there's no guarantee.
That's
There's no
right.
guarantee that you'll end up out at the end of it.
Yeah.
But does it necessarily follow?
But does that matter?
Does it necessarily follow that if you have a married purpose zone underneath the historic reserve at the big par up the Waikato River, that Hoki Rangiora,
Yeah.
that you have to change the reserve status? Does it follow?
Well, it doesn't to me, but I'm simply reacting to the legal advice we've received.
We understand that.
We have been discussing this in-house for quite some time now, since these submissions came in, and personally, I'm of your view.
What's the current zone? What's the current zoning of Hoki Rangiora?
I think it's open space or.
Is it open space?
Or rural
When
production.
we were there, Joe, the lady that we went to, she was talking about the forestry, that the activities on site, which destroyed a lot of, rural production type facilities. So you can run cows and sheep on the reserve under the zone, but you can't maintain it for its intrinsic values. This is where I really struggle with
I agree.
the fact, but I think you'd have to convince us that we can't, it's not an option for us for whatever reason. And it's section 32 cents, as David said.
Yeah, I think that we need to decide what's the most appropriate zoning.
Yeah.
And so whether it's the current zoning, open space, or whatever it is, or whether it's married purpose, so that's the decision we need to make. And so you might decide, putting aside the legalities of this reserves act process, and we all acknowledge it, and we do need to be quite clear that that's not a roadblock to us considering the rezoning. Then I think you need to make quite clear what you think is zoning, and it may be that even though there's a submission seeking married purpose zone, you still have the view that the notified zoning is the most appropriate zoning. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth at all, but that's the exercise and right of reply that and be guided by the strategic, well, the question is, what are the objectives? And this method of zoning, which is most appropriate to give effect to that objective in relation to that particular piece of land.
Yeah.
The second issue, Joe, is notwithstanding all of that, and I'm just taking a lead from Maria's evidence yesterday, indicated that that from her submission point of view, she had limited scope on this matter. So I guess we need to decide, well, whether there's scope anyway for all of the reserves that are being sought. So
There is scope for some.
there is scope for
Yeah,
some.
not for currently necessarily. but
Yes.
for,
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, maybe just a schedule when you're 42A on that would be useful for a quick checklist.
Sure.
That's not 42A, ROI.
Yep.
Okay.
Is there anything else that came up? that I don't think-
I think the other issue, we did agree to rezone the deed of recognition areas that were requested by Aotearoa and rezoned to open space. And we did 11 out of 15 of those, 3 of them were already rezoned. Since then, obviously, Market Evidence has requested that they also be rezoned Māori purpose. But I think that's out of scope from the original submission, so we can't do that. And then there were two other aspects, probably general request for rezoning of the park.
Yes.
Essentially, the issue here is that I did speak to Ms. Marco about that, and aside from noting that there are 88 Urupa already in Schedule 3, we weren't sure, because I don't think we've done that work to whether we had covered all of them, and it is only a very general submission request. There's no specificity about that. It just really just says Urupa, yeah. And so I requested sort of some clarity, and but I think the critical aspect to that would be that we really haven't had a chance to talk to the Māori trustees or the trustees of each of the parts to check that that would be, accept rezoning. I'm sure that probably we need, but we haven't been able to undertake that process.
But just on those I presume Joe most of those would have their own record of title, or would there be a mixture?
I think there'd be a mixture. I'm really not sure because we haven't done that work. We did some work in respect to Urupa around funding for Marae or grants for looking after Urupa. And I'm really not sure, whether the status was covered necessarily in that work. It wasn't part of my work.
But you see this as part of the future work.
Yes,
So the
absolutely.
council.
Yeah.
We're certainly interested in springboarding off on the recommendation report, acknowledging that type of
Absolutely.
future process which we've already done.
Yeah.
And there's more work to do on a lot of these land issues.
That's right, and as Ms. Marco identified yesterday, these are need to prioritise what they want to do first. So, I'm happy to have that discussion.
Would you, we're talking about Waurika here, aren't we?
Yes.
Would you add in the native rezoning, potential rezoning of native reserves into that work stream also?
Yes, absolutely. That was the next thing I was going to come on to. Okay.
Because previously, in terms of this legal issue about revocation, that we've been talking about dog reserves, haven't we? Solely.
That's right. There is still an issue around native reserves. I was looking into the information we have, which was actually provided to me by Ms. Markle, which goes back to a report done in 1991 for the tribunal. Yeah, it's a lot of information potentially there for each reserve. So there's a lot of unpacking to do, because obviously the reserves have now been parcelled into lots of different parcels and lots of different uses. So it's quite a long process to actually investigate those, and it's definitely something that probably we would see as being future work programs. Yeah, there's a lot of historical historical material out there already.
I've got 42A report, pages 12 and 13, where you identify six reserves, and I think you've recommended some of them could be changed. And this is where I think the Simpson Grierson advice comes in. Just looking at Pukerangiora Park, that's currently zoned rural production zone. Do you think the multi-purpose zone would be any more or less discordant with the historic reserve status than the rural production zone?
I think it's a lot less discordant, potentially, than rural production zone. I mean, obviously it is, I haven't been out there, but from what you say, it sounds like it's grazed and it is being used as rural production land.
But I think some of it has had forestry on it, and that's caused some upset with those sort of rural production activities. If you ever wanted a nice drive on a nice day, it's certainly.
Whereabouts is it? I didn't get it.
So that's way up sort of midway up the White River. And I wondered, Christine, can we just bring up, we have an address for your incredible complex.
Seated one White Road.
And those cliffs, 100 meters high on the river, and just on the top of that image there, down in the, see where the A, is there a little pebble A? That's a sap, which you can still see that the British forces built to try and get up to the Palisade. Yeah, so it is an incredible site that, so if you ever wanted to drive on a nice day, it's a great place to go and see.
So that's an archaeological sesame site, is it?
There's two there. There's an archaeological site up top and then adjoining, which is the main park site.
Extended over the road as well. But that top is where the sap is.
Yes, I remember the step. Yeah. I mean, that's a good example of that exercise. What is the best zoning to reflect current activities, but also protect the resources? So, I mean, if you've got a rural production zone currently with overlays, are they sufficient in their own right? Would a change to the multi-purpose zone affect the balance in terms of the current land use? Is that balance, are the values protected by the overlay?
They are to some extent, because those particular sites don't have an extent on them yet, so they do a 200 metre, but still, I take your point.
The Department of Conservation, this was Antoine's point yesterday, they haven't further submitted, they have been silent.
I've tried very hard to get some feedback from them. I've emailed and run the planner and the legal advisor, but I've had no response. And I did give them the date. We gave them yesterday's date.
Can you just recall back to your reply for us in terms of because I think it's really in response to the questions from Antoine yesterday, Joe, you could actually say there's a response to the queries made by Antoine, just so we've got that in your reply.
Sure.
Okay, I think that's good enough to go on with. That's been a really good discussion. Thank you, Joe. Louise.
I'm just going to give a bit of an overview on some of the questions that were asked that kind of go across
multiple zones and in relation to the MPSUD. So one of the first questions raised was alignment of the strategic direction UFD chapter with the MPSUD. And it was questioned or asked if we could confirm there are no gaps and no other changes we'd like to make to the proposed district plan to ensure it aligns with the MPSUD. We will respond to this in the written right reply. And during the opening presentation, there was a discussion about how short, medium and long-term land supply is recognised in UFD strategic objectives. The panel observed that this should align with MPSUD and that the correct reference should be made within strategic objectives. So I've reviewed the wording in the UFD chapter and I'm satisfied that this wording is aligned. However, I would like time to analyse this against the UD and in light of what I've heard in the hearing. And I'll provide a confirmed position in the written right reply. And if there's any changes, I will suggest any amendments through that written right reply. The next bit relates to the MPSUD and the development capacity terminology. There was a question posed around the use of the different terms, such as plan enabled, feasible capacity, infrastructure ready, reasonably expected to be realised development capacity. If you like, I can go through what each one means. Do you want me to do that?
No, I asked that.
Yeah, no, that's all good.
Cover that in your
Yes, I am going to cover that in the right reply and explain how each term contributes to the sufficient development capacity and housing bottom lines, and what scenario each term should be used in. So I'll expand on that in the written right reply.
But the reason I asked that question was one, to understand the terminology, second, to make sure we're working from the same base terminology when we're looking at supply and demand.
Definitely,
and not comparing, readily feasible with feasible.
Definitely, because I know different submitters have used, some's used planned enabled, some use feasible, so yeah.
And that will go to the table that I talked to you and Campbell about in terms of the, with Mr. Heath's contribution.
That links into the next bit of information that was requested, that you've requested that we update short, medium and long-term development capacity based on all the reporting planners recommended zone changes. So this work's multifaceted and will take some time to compile. So we propose we provide this and combine it with the residential zone information requested of Mr. Campbell and Mr. Fringley. I'd just like to touch on the infrastructure capacity in the small townships. Commissioner Date was particularly interested in the 3 water infrastructure capacity of the small towns, such as Leperton, Egmont Village and Uranui. And there was a request of the overview of this capacity be supplied as part of the written right reply. So I can confirm we've already had some initial discussions with our council's water and waste team, and I've just got a couple of high-level comments I'll provide now, and further detail of this will be provided in the written right reply. So currently Okato, Uranui, Leperton and Egmont Village and other small rural settlements such as Tikarangi and Onairo are on septic tank systems. And in relation to potable water, Okato, Uranui, Leperton, Tikarangi is partial and Onairo have potable water supplies, however Egmont Village does not. I also wanted to say in relation to this that there is no national system or standard to require maintenance on the septic tanks. And it's not uncommon for our septic tanks to fail as they reach the end of their life. So, and to perform well, the septic tanks, the settlement's reliance on the settlement tanks require adequate space and manage density load, ideally away from water bodies. And the greater the population, the greater the cumulative impact, meaning the system will become less effective. And this has come to head in Uranui recently, as the population has increased. Poorly managed septic tanks have been breaking down and polluting water bodies. So as a result, council is now having to articulate or a need to resolve this issue. So a formalised response in the right reply from our water and waste team will go into this in more detail for you guys.
Because there are some significant, you know, we hear them up, significant requests around Lifton, Egmont Village, Alcoy's service for wastewater, so it's different.
Yeah.
And clearly the Uranui request, that larger one is pretty significant. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, it'd be quite helpful. I mean, I can do the research, but if you're going to be putting it together to outline for us what the regional council requirements are for on-site wastewater disposal.
And also whether there's any red flags on those joining streams and their state of environment reporting for water quality stories.
Yeah.
That would be chloride, phosphorus, elevation. They might sort of be triggered by the small town septic tank cumulative effects.
Oh, and so that leads me into the last bit, which a question was raised around the 750 square metre minimum lot size in the low density residential zones in relation to septic tanks. So after my discussions I've had with the water and waste team, so that 750 metre square is the minimum land area required to provide for septic tanks. That they can needed so that they can accommodate all the requirements under the building code. But I will go into, as asked, further detail as in the written reply how we've landed at that 750, because there was discussions with our building consents team, the Building Act and diagrams and drawings. So I'll go into further detail on that in the written reply.
Thank you.
Hey,
That's you?
that's me.
Yep.
You didn't front up with you've got NPSUD there and your thing. I just wanted to ask you something I discussed with Sarah Mako yesterday. When the district plan was being developed, the NPSUDC was the overriding national policy statement. And I mean, it's very different to the NPSUD. In the engagement and consultation with Tangata Whenua, it's also very different. And I just wanted to get a sense from you. The NPSUDC doesn't seem to contemplate, except at a very high level, any engagement with iwi whatsoever as council works through development capacity assessments or those sorts of things. I guess I want to talk to you then about what, acknowledging that and the fact that the plan was notified under that policy regime, in that along the way, not only have the deliverables for urban development changed by the UD, but also the process by which councils go about that by having to engage more with Tangata Whenua. And I guess I'm just interested in how we do that after we've already, we've already built this plan and notified it in accordance with one regime. Yes, the deliverables have changed, and we can give effect to them to the extent we can with submissions. What advice do you have for us, and this is potentially a collective question, in terms of the process changing along the way in terms of engagement with Tangata Whenua? I don't know if you heard Sarah yesterday saying that to some extent what we have been doing along the way and looking to almost retrofit into the policy provisions greater engagement on the ground. She indicated that it would be part of the way, but sort of not all of the way. And I'm still a little bit perplexed as to whether that's something we can solve and if we can, how we do it, given that we've started down one road and the road has changed along the way.
Yeah, it is a tricky one. I mean, we probably did go further than
what the NPSUD required in terms of discussions with
UDC.
UDC, sorry, yeah, UDC required in terms of discussions and involvement with tangata whenua, because obviously we had the Ngā Tiaki group.
Yeah.
I would need to confirm whether all the zones went to them. Like I know all the growth zones did, like the future urban zone, the structure plan zone. Obviously, you talked about the Maori purpose zone with them.
Only briefly.
Only briefly, yes. I'd need to confirm what other discussions were held with and around the zonings. So that went a certain way. Yeah, I would say I definitely think this process has evolved a lot as we've gone through it, and taking the time to resolve the issues and have those conversations with them, for example, like the structure plan process. We're taking extra time to go through and sit down with them and try and resolve those concerns. Yeah, it's a bit hard because we're trying to retrofit it, but that goes, I think I agree with Sarah, that goes some way to resolving concerns. Whether there is a way, yeah, I'd have to think about that a bit more as to whether there was a way we could reach.
Yeah. Happy to jump in a little bit there, because I have been with others talking about, I guess, how the plan was set up through the Ngā Tiaki forum, and I guess the process which we stepped through with that forum about how tangata whenua were to be, what the expectations around how they were to engage with all levels of the plan. So obviously that was sort of set up in 2016 and involved a wide ranging of hui. There was independent planning advice associated with that forum, and that process really stepped through, went from a first principles sort of basis, sort of stepping through the key issues that the district plan was looking to address.
Really good presentation on that at the outset.
Yes, and
Yeah.
didn't Sean Zelchi's
Yeah.
sort of seconded in some way to the, he would help them with responses to the plan, the draft, and then the proposed?
So my understanding is that he acted as the independent planning advisor, then he also acted as a friend of the
Submitters, which I think we've heard that, but again, in terms of Kit's question, it's part of it. It's part of it.
Yeah, I guess the interesting question is, if you were doing this plan now under the auspices of the NPSUD, would you do anything different? In terms of the Ngā Tiaki forum was an inspired idea ultimately. I imagine there were a lot of other reasons why that sort of coalesced to create that. It doesn't seem to have been required under the NPSUDC, but you've done it anyway, which I applaud. If the NPSUD and its greater focus on engagement with tangata whenua through the planning process and urban development was the guiding light now, would you do anything different?
Well, perhaps there could have been more of a focus on the spatial extents of the zones in detail, because I think the forum focused quite rightly at the time around a much more broad conversation around where tangata whenua were going to expect the rubber to hit the road in the various chapters. Where were they going to see objectives and policies which were heavy and Hapuri centric? And I think there was a broad introduction to the council's growth strategy, to the zones which had been selected from the national planning standards. My understanding is that the concept, for example, of the medium density zone was supported, but it was more about the role and function of that zone as opposed to where the council was looking to put it, particularly in light of the submission which has come through from Kaingoa, which is really looked at a broad upscaling. So that's my understanding of where the focus did lie. So,
and to some extent that's played out throughout the hearings, where tangata whenua have complained that they weren't involved enough are clearly those areas that were not the focus of Ngā Tiaki, but those where they've been very happy with the engagement and involvement, like the multi-purpose zone. They've come along and applauded that. So it's sort of and the strategic objective framework. So you can actually see by reference to their reaction throughout the hearings, those areas where they didn't potentially get enough or engagement with. But that's, I mean, I don't know if there's a criticism that needs to be landed anywhere here. It's just, I think, potentially how the process unfolded. Yeah.
I mean, the zones we did provide the specific details on were the structure plans and the future urban zones. So they had the detail on those, but yeah, like Campbell said, the mixed use, they may be
the design
more
guides,
design guides.
Yeah.
It was more a high level of.
This is what the plan's
provisions.
going to have.
Exactly. So some we did, but some we didn't.
We tried to test this yesterday with Dion and Liana, and so with Sarah and Commissioner John asked a question of all three about the spatial extent, trying to ascertain whether there'd been a substantial increase in the spatial extent of the residential zone, to try and ascertain then why was there the concern, or why was the opposition to the upzoning of that to medium density from Kaingaroa. We're trying to see whether it was spatially an issue or whether it was the intensity of development that was the issue. And I think that one of the questions that I'd be interested in knowing is, putting aside rezoning requests for one zone to residential, how does the proposed district plan spatially relate to the operative district plan in terms of the residential zone? Were there substantial, I'm not hearing that there were substantial increases in areas, but if there were, what were they? Where were they? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because what we heard from Kaingaroa is that they're largely, I guess, jettisoning their own landholding in favour of enabling high density on zone land by others. That was the impression that the Kaingaroa team gave me, at least.
They're selling off land.
They're not selling off land, but yeah.
Sorry.
So you went there.
Yeah, sorry.
Can I just finish?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So that was quite Mr. I can't remember the Kaingaroa manager's name, but he was just sitting here, and he provided quite an interesting insight into their strategy in New Plymouth in terms of their own land holding versus the land holdings of others, and how it was all about providing supply so that gave housing choice and affordability. We tried to test that yesterday and with representatives, and I'm not sure that they understood where Kaingaroa was coming from. So hence my question about the spatial extent. Were there major departures from the operative plan strategy spatially, or are they largely the same? And really the difference is the intensity of development on that same spatial area of land. So if that could be captured in the right of reply, that would be useful.
Yeah, sure. And I do have some figures in front of me, which I think I mentioned in my section 42A report. So the overall makeup of the three residential zones has changed in terms of the proportion of the overall residential area. So when compared to the residential A to general residential zone, you've got an increase of 164 hectares as notified. Residential B through to medium density, you've got an increase of 40 hectares. And then residential C to the low density residential, you've got a reduction there of about 75 hectares.
Yes, I remember that table when you were, and there was an error in the first line.
There was a slight error.
The 164, is that the correct figure now?
That's correct.
It was a different figure, wasn't it? Yeah. And a reduction of 75 on C, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. Funny what comes back to you. Only a week ago.
Yes.
Thank you, Kevin.
David, just to confirm, I was here for the Kaingaroa
No, I mean,
submissions,
I-
but I've read, what I was trying to say was, certainly read Campbell's presentation with our report, does have the table with the areas, but what you're looking for is the spatial map
Yes.
showing where the
yes.
the overs and unders have come between the ODP and the proposed district plan and the residential zoning.
Yes.
So you might see where that
Yeah.
spatial variations
Yeah.
happen.
Putting aside any submissions seeking changes to that spatial layer. Yeah.
Well, okay, we can supply that.
Can have you work toward the end of that, questions about the mana whenua input?
Yeah, I'm just now thinking through how we actually want it, but that's good for us.
But just for me, I think that question, it was, yesterday was interesting in terms of our decision making. We have a plan that was proposed under the PSUDC. We have already sort of indicated that we'll look within the scope of the submissions we have and the processes within this panel to work towards as much of the NPSUD outcomes as we can, including engagement with mana whenua. The scope of their submissions has given us some ability to progress along lines that they're looking for. And also, particularly in my mind, I think the ability for mana whenua to work in association with council planners and other submitters on progressing some of their aspirations in terms of their submission does get us partially on the way as well. Would that be a fair summary?
It's an interim policy 9, starting with policy 9 of the SUD. It's all very much focused on involvement in the preparation of planning documents. I guess there's the question is, are we still involved in the preparation of a planning document? Or did preparation cease the date it was notified? Anyway, that's something for us to get our heads around. Thanks.
All right. But always where it's formed quite a discussion. I have a meeting at 12:15. Just three quarters of an hour. So shall we just do the next one, which is Campbell, Dermot, Louise? And then see how you like to report back to us?
Thank you. So just in relation to obviously the Kaingora submission, it was a big one and a big team involved and a really useful discussion. So obviously headlining that was the revised position which had come forward from Kaingora, which had reduced their, in relation to the medium density zone, and the amount of area sought for rezoning, sort of reducing from over 700 hectares to about 170. And I think it's fair to say that that's allowed a much more targeted appraisal of that submission. So that has been useful. So there was a range of evidence and questions from the commissioners on this, a lot of homework for the Kaingora officials, which we're getting now. So the aim is to really present an integrated sort of package to the panel in response to this submission. As part of this, it would be a review of further Section 32AA review of the Kaingora revised position. I think this is going to build on the work that Mr. Ray and Mr. Campbell in particular have been asked to go away and do. And we're sort of thinking about the best way to actually visually present this as well, because we kind of see this as their revised Section 32AA base. We're going to then take that forward and review it from a, I guess, planning aspect, three waters, transport, and also landscaping. What we're going to do as well is include some of the work that Louise is doing, just on the specific implications of any further rezoning of medium density lands under the NPSUD. Mr. Heath will be involved in that process as well, sort of looking at the economic costs and benefits of the revised Kaingora position. And then ultimately, what we would like to present to the panel is some recommendations as to whether or not we think further medium density zone land is warranted. And if so, how much? And where's the best place in the city to put it, bearing in mind all of the the constraints and the opportunities which we're going to map out. And I think that would naturally involve a review of all we know across the city in terms of where investment is targeted and three-quarters and roading, etc. Also our map constraints or overlays. So there has been some work which has been undertaken already. So we've had a short workshop between consenting policy, three-quarters and roading to sort of look at our initially broadly at the areas which have been put up. And I can confirm that council officials and Kaingoa officials are undertaking a joint site visit on Monday the 27th. It involves Mr. Campbell, Mr. Ray and others. So the aim is that the written right of reply for the rezoning request will be submitted in conjunction with the written right of reply for the residential chapters. And I think that it very much reflects the integrated nature of those pieces of work. I think Mr. Liggett, made a really good point around Kaingoa have sought a large area of rezoning, but they've also sought a more enabling framework in terms of the effect standards. So if I was of mind to provide some further relief to the effect standards, that I think would have an implication on how much further land that we might recommend be upzoned. And then, as Louise sort of mentioned, there's going to be a broad piece of work around the overall where we've landed on land supply more generally, and sort of testing the recommendations against the PSUD. I did want to just offer the panel a quick update on design guides as well, because I think it's a sort of more discrete piece of work that is related to this overall picture. So since the design guides hearings, we've had further korero between Council Te Atiara and Taranaki Iwi, and that reflects willingness to address the concerns which those submitters outlined at the hearing, that the design guides needed to better reflect Te Ao Māori and tikanga. So we actually had our first meeting with the parties on Monday, just gone, and we've agreed to move forward and to try and improve the content within the scope of the submissions, and sort of noting, I guess, the time and process constraints which we're under, and the aim basically being to come forward with any recommended content changes as part of a written right of reply on the 28th of July.
You've given us a timetable for that job sign off on, so that's consistent
with
there.
that note to the panel earlier this week. Just turning to the more discrete rezoning matters. There was a question in relation to the Taranaki Cathedral rezoning. So just acknowledge the evidence from Catherine Hooper and Jenny Goddard, and the merits of that scheme, and that's reflected in, I think, the resource consents which have been approved for that site. There's a huge range of benefits going to be delivered. But in terms of the actual questions raised around the rezoning itself, the cathedral have sought to change the rezoning from general residential to mixed-use zone. Like other church sites, the zoning as proposed doesn't truly reflect what's historically gone on the site. But I think, given the planning constraints on that site, I still think it is the best fit for the land. Sort of noting that the two consents which have been approved for the site both sort of allow a comprehensive physical redevelopment of the site, and they also allow for a wider range of community uses over and above uses which have historically happened on the site. So I think just a last comment on that, was that I didn't find that the evidence, suggested that the zoning as proposed would sort of unduly sort of encumber church, or be directly inconsistent with the consents which have been approved. Commissioner Dace, I know you did ask for a quick bit of advice around whether or not, or the difference in the residential zone and the mixed use zone, how that relates to the high traffic generation rules. So both those zones are subject to that rule. So that's Tran R8, which controls high trip generator activities. So that relates to activities. That rather than zones. So it doesn't change it specifically because of the zone. So that is run on an activities basis. So sort of just to confirm that places of assembly, community facilities, sport and recreation activities accommodating more than 200 people at any one time requires a resource consent as a restricted discretionary activity. There was a question as well, just in relation to, or an observation from you, Chair Dace, around the Settlers Bush site. And you looked at the alignment of the public access corridor there. So just to confirm that the corridor should be located on the northern side of the SNA on that property, following the legal boundary. I think as proposed in the plan at the moment, the alignment's going through the middle of the bush, so we'll clean that up as part of the sleep up hearing. That was all I had. That's the answer to questions.
No, I mean, I just want to acknowledge the large amount of work required in relation to that KO submission. Effectively, what you're doing is what tier 1 councils around the country are doing through a variation process. So I just want to acknowledge the significant amount of work that's involved in that in a very short period of time.
I was going to say the same. We're hugely grateful, but what you get with a plan that's moving at pace through a changing statutory regime, trying to be as adaptable as possible, but appreciate that it means work for you guys as well.
Sounds like you're up for it though. Absolutely. Yeah.
Sharp end of the job.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
Good to hear that you've got a site visit, because we certainly cognizant and impressed by the advice we're getting from both Kainora and the council planning team. They've come back to the hearings with much more focused work, and I'm glad that they've done that work otherwise, because we needed to do it. Get the resolution that we're looking for. It's one of these areas where I think scope reduced does give some areas to really look at an outcome that might be just right for you, isn't it?
I've got a bit to add into residential about Armstrong Ave. Do you want me to start? Or do you want to?
Let's come back to that.
It's White Road, isn't it?
White Road, yeah. I've got some maps and stuff, so it's probably going to take longer than 5 minutes.
2 o'clock, if we. Sorry,
1
o'clock.
1 o'clock.
I'm looking at 2 on the. 1 o'clock. We'll get back into it.
Okay.
Louise, you're all prepared to talk to us about Waitara?
Yep. Christine's just going to hand out some bits of paper. I'll talk to those shortly.
Yes.
The first thing I just wanted to talk to in relation to Armstrong Ave Waitara, It was just, we had a discussion around the indicative road rule and its activity status. The day before. So I've just had another look at this, and the activity status of the subdivision under sub R8 is our DIS. And if you've got an indicative road shown on the property and gets taken into account at the time of the subdivision, this rule actually stops at our DIS, and there's no trigger for it to go to another category or activity status. So it doesn't default to non-complying, as I initially said a couple of days ago. So I just wanted to highlight that, and this rule is the same in the operative district plan.
Yes, that was a question I put to you, Louise.
Yes,
So,
yes.
So rather than going for another activity, it's captured by the matter of discretion.
Correct, yeah. So whether you provide the road or not, it's the discretion is within that rule.
So which rules that in? Which chapter?
Sub R8.
Nothing in the tram chapter though, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's captured under sub R8. There is setbacks in like for structures on indicative roads, but the actual provision of is captured in the subdivision chapter. So unless you subdivide, it won't be taken.
All zones. Whether the indicative road transport network is taken into account in the subdivision plan.
So Louise, on a subdivision application, if the indicative road was moved around, that wouldn't make any difference to the consent status. That's where
No.
Correct. No. As long as we're trying to achieve the same linkage, the straight through and to the other property.
What if it's not even used?
If it's not provided, it's still restricted discretionary as well.
Still RD, so-
It's still RD, yeah. So,
Is there any policy that supports that rule? Sorry, I'm just looking through.
Yep, I'll just bring up.
I'm looking through the policy.
Feedback into the subdivision.
Require infrastructure to be provided.
There's a policy in the transport section,
Oh, yeah.
Tran P4. Identify and map indicative road transport networks.
It's identified, man.
The sub P4 require infrastructure.
Okay. Oh, it's something.
And infrastructure. Yeah, more general in terms of infrastructure rather than specific to the indicative roads.
Yeah, it's probably covered in P8 to some extent. Require greenfield subdivision design and that respond positively to and be integrated with the surrounding context, including by maximising accessibility and connectivity and an interconnected transport network. So if you didn't do an indicative road and it led to a disconnected transport network, then you could potentially refuse that.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks.
So the first bit I wanted to highlight, you've got a couple of sheets. This one here, the double-sided one. So I'll get onto the mapping request that you asked to show the different zones in operative district plan, proposed district plan. But while we were undertaking that exercise, we actually found an error in the 42A. So this is just to highlight what the error is. So this first map in the 42A in Appendix 1, we included this bit of land that's hatched in red and said that that would be zoned to future urban. That is actually existing residential in operative and proposed district plan, and it's not one of the rural bits that we were proposing to rezone, so that was an error to be included. And if you look on the back, I've shown the correct area of the land parcels that are subject to this rezoning. They're correctly identified in the 42A by the addresses, but just the map in the appendix added an extra piece of extra parcel of land that shouldn't be included. So I just wanted to flag that. And then do you want to bring those maps up, Christine? We've had some maps produced that show the different zonings, the operative district plan, the proposed district plan zonings, the area. So this shows with it, unfortunately, they don't show the development on the Tangaroa Street because that's post the 2019 aerial. But this just gives you an indication of the existing residential and the proposed area that this request includes. If you scroll to next. Oh, that's just zoomed out to show it in relation to the wider area of Waitara. And then that's another zoomed in closer of the Armstrong Ave with the underlying proposed district plan residential layer. Any questions on those maps? Oh yeah, that's one I've just discussed with the era.
Just on the maps there, just looking at that. So that strike parcel, just let me explain around that. That's not a parcel of land that was ODP rural that was recommended to go to residential. That was already ODP residential.
Correct.
Okay.
It's the Ministry of Education piece of land. That was just a pure error in the map identification.
Okay.
In the 42A.
Yeah.
And the
Not in
appendix,
the plan.
yes, in the 42A where I detail what addresses, I've got the correct addresses. It's just the visual representation of it was incorrect.
So then there were two. So there were two. Well, there was an island effectively of rural there between the Ministry of Education and the stream, and then there was all of the stuff accessed off Armstrong that was all rural as well.
Yeah, so it was 22B Princess, which is the one that accesses that right away down beside the Waitara High School.
Yeah.
For the one if you move the cursor towards Princess, there's 46 Princess Street. Oh no, the other way.
Sorry.
Oh, do you want me to point out?
22B Princess. Is that Mr.
So that's
Lambert's
Mr.
property, is
Lambert's
it?
there, 22B Princess Street, which is accessed
Off,
Yeah.
off that driveway effectively.
off that driveway. This one's 46 Princess because it's accessed off here, and then we've got 2A and 2 and 2A, 7 and 9.
Okay. Which one was Mr. Phelan's?
9.
No. And 7 is the one that's been apparently under contract by Mr. Drever.
By Mr. Drever, yep. Who's the developer of the wider Armstrong Ave area.
Thanks.
Okay, so in relation to the Armstrong Ave area in Waitara, in the written right of reply, I will review my zoning recommendation for 2, 2A, 7 and 9 Armstrong Ave, 22B and 46 Princess Street properties, taking into consideration the following. The change of position of Mr. Lamberts and Mr. Phelan, who in the hearing indicated they would now support a residential zoning for their property. Te Aotearoa's cultural concerns and request for the area to be structure planned before developed. Their need for the indicative road to remain on 7 Armstrong Ave in New Waitara. The scope to rezone the land to fuzz, and whether the fuzz is the most appropriate zoning or whether there is another mechanism to enable the structure planning to occur concurrently with a residential zoning. This will explore whether there is a mechanism to create some sort of bespoke provisions for this area to align with the cultural considerations such that fuzz P7 requires.
In that context, Louise, could you just reflect back on Sarah Mako's suggestions for additional provisions to go into the residential zone chapters?
Yes, like some sort of.
She's already volunteered those.
Yes, that's what I was sort of trying to say with this bespoke
Well, to some extent, it wouldn't be bespoke.
Or
but
bespoke, yeah.
Her recommendation is that they go into the residential towns across the board, so that any resource consent or within, below, the medium and the general residential zone would have matters of discretion that made or sort of encouraged engagement and an outcome that was consistent with cultural values at
Yeah.
that stage. And whether that is something that is could potentially, I guess, bridge the gap or the issue to some extent.
Yeah, I can look at whether it's, just specific to this or whether it's something we need to do across the board.
Yeah, I should clarify that that's certainly a matter I'm taking up. as
Yeah,
part of
okay.
my
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
together there's a sort of a link there.
Yes,
because
yeah, we'll
even
work
though,
together on that one.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, so that might be a potential solution to address those,
Yeah.
Which is similar sort of provisions we've got in that structure planning for fast
The
piece.
other, I guess the other piece of evidence that Mr. Lambert and Mr. Phelan revealed is that they have no inclination in their lifetime to do anything with that land. Whereas you've got a developer, Mr. Drever, who apparently is ready to sort of go on land that is serviced and appears to be infinitely useful for residential. Whether a broader sort of structure planning proposal that tied that land to the broader parcels where those two landowners have no interest whatsoever in doing it is really an efficient way to move it along.
Yeah, so whether it's, I mean, I'll consider all of that,
Yeah.
whether we need to it could be that we rezone some residential and the rest is fuzzed for the future. We'll weigh all that up and come back in the original right to
Yeah,
reform.
pretty small area of fuzz though, wouldn't it? Like one
this-
site,
Yeah,
two sites potentially.
Yeah. I don't know the dwelling yield of 7 Armstrong, but the wider, that whole piece of land is 300 dwellings.
Okay.
So it's a reasonable amount of supply for us. Yeah,
300.
all of that fascinating.
So Louise, just back on Kit's point about Sierra suggestions for the residential zone.
Yeah.
When she gave evidence, she drew from the plan change 49 Johnson Road process, which made its way through that private plan change, and through that process, they worked up some provisions that seemed to work for these sort of areas that enable the structure planning to happen within the residential areas with the sort of right considerations. So I think that's been road tested, and communications I've had since that with the process going forward is that worked pretty well.
Cool. No, I can take that all into consideration and come back in the written road reply.
Thank you, and perhaps this hearing has unlocked a few more possibilities.
Definitely, I think it has.
Thank you, Louise.
No worries.
Right, Lauren.
Okay, commercial and mixed use zones. Just a reminder, we've got about 6 areas here in contention, and we've got 2 submitters, one being Te Aotearoa and the other being Kaingaora. So I'll just run through them in the order that I put them in the back of my PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
And it's perhaps a little bit difficult to pick up on what Kaingaora are seeking. So I've had to go through all of the maps and then that presentation so you can see the bits that are in contention. So first one up is from Te Aotearoa for 4147 Elliott Street in Plymouth. And just a reminder there that land is mixed use zone. Te Aotearoa sought city centre zone, and then I made the recommendation in my commercial mixed use zone road reply that we apply a living precinct on some of the areas around the city centre zone. So yeah, I indicated at the start of my presentation that I'm happy for that to happen, given that Te Aotearoa asked to do that. I think it's a good compromise between ensuring that the city centre is vibrant and also helping Iwi to achieve their aspirations. And in terms of how I've looked at the other pieces that have been identified as living precinct. I think this one also fits the bill because it's very close to the city centre. It's next to the eastern neighbourhood that council has identified in its city centre strategy. And it's also close to the coastal walkway and the park.
Is that one? Yes.
Okay. So next up is St. Auburn Street, which is down towards the coast, next to Mitre 10. So I've recommended that that stay as medium density and try and seek that that be mixed use. So I don't recommend that we change this to mixed use. This area contains a car yard on one lot, and then another lot has already got a form of medium density in place. The lot that's got the housing in place has got a row of one-story flats on one side, and then it's got another row of two-story flats on the other side. And I think this area is going to be quite ripe for medium density housing in the future. It's really, really close to the coastal walkway. You're only about one block back, and it's a very popular area in terms of easily being able to get onto that walkway and then walk into town. And then it's also got good transport linkages as well, because it's running along that State Highway 44 between the city centre and the port. So yeah, bearing in mind that we've got the NPSUD direction, and then we're not really wanting to expand our existing centres, so yeah, I recommend that one stays as is. Next up is West Town, up by the hospital.
Saunders.
Yes, corner of, it's actually Sanders Ave and 2 Popper Street. So I've spoken with Campbell regarding Climate Laura's request for increasing medium density in the wider area. And I understand that he's open to considering more medium density in this area, which may mean that a bigger centre is warranted. So work's underway to finalise our position, as Campbell outlined earlier. So I'll work closely with him on that, because I think I'm likely to align with whatever he proposes. What I can say now, though, is that 2 Poppers are a really significant road in our road transport network, and it carries on average 14,250 vehicles a day. It's very, very busy. It's a very busy intersection. So my initial concern was that if we were to put local centre zoning on the other side, people are going to want to walk in a circular fashion around that roundabout. And there is a traffic signal on the left-hand side where you can actually walk out and stop the traffic if you press a button, so all the traffic stops while you walk across, and everyone kind of glares at you because you make them stop. But on the other side,
Wouldn't happen.
well,
Just go straight through.
on the other side,
My wrist is so tight about it. Mind you, we're all like that when in the car. Sorry.
that's all right. That's how I feel anyway. Press the button and wait for the stairs. But yes, on the other side, I'm concerned on that right-hand side of Sanders Ave, if we were to zone that you're going to have people wanting to cross across the road, and there isn't really any safe facility there to do that. So I went and had a chat to the guys in our transport team, and they already have some consultation that they're undertaking at the end of June on this particular area, and it is about safety and improving accessibility in this area. And then they're going to design some interventions with the words they use, and that will come in within the next year. And they did actually mention the possibility of making this intersection one of those barn dance pedestrian crossings where you kind of all walk across at the same time and work out who's going first. So
That's a great name.
Yeah, cool. You get into the middle, do-si-do, turn around and go.
yeah.
Yeah.
the term they actually gave me, a barn dance
You
pedestrian.
don't know what I'll do after the hearing finishes. Stephen.
So, yeah,
Way too familiar.
so if that happens, I mean, that would be ideal from
Yeah.
my perspective. And I think it would be fabulous for that centre, particularly if we do make that recommendation to rezone medium density in that area. So I think the right of reply will probably come out before that consultation's finished, but I'll keep that in mind in terms of how I respond back.
Would that find its way into some sort of long-term plan? I mean, as a line entry or something?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's important that you capture that discussion in your right of reply. So you can make a call on this, how much we can rely on that to overcome your initial concerns about traffic, pedestrian safety.
Okay. Okay, so next up is the western end of the CBD. So this is where Kaingaora is seeking that it be mixed use zone with a living precinct on top. So I don't recommend that we rezone this. I agree with the intent behind the living precinct, that being to have the residential intensification near the central city. However, my concern is that residential intensification is not guaranteed, because ultimately the underlying zone is a mixed use zone. And I think it's more likely that if this area was zoned as a mixed use zone, with the precinct on top, that the activities are actually going to end up being used for commercial service activities that are permitted in the mixed use zone, as opposed to residential activities. And if it's going to be rezoned as a mixed use zone, it's going to be an extra block and a half that we're adding on to our central city area, in an area that's already underperforming, and it goes against the economic advice that we've received from Mr. Heath as well. So I think there's actually more guarantee that we'll get residential intensification through the existing zoning in the PDP, as opposed to the mixed use zone with the living precinct on top. You know, I just wanted to remind you of where the height limits are at. I believe Campbell has recommended in his section 42A report that the height limit for medium density be increased from 9 to 10. And in my right of reply for the mixed use zone, I recommended that it be increased from 10 to 14. So at this stage, the recommended height limits are 10 in the medium density versus 14 in the mixed use. So I can kind of see why Kaingaora are seeking that mixed use living zone precinct because of that additional height limit. But ultimately, I think that there is a risk that even if I did place that mixed use living zone precinct on it, that because our underlying zoning is mixed use, it will go to mixed use.
It wouldn't transition to your.
Yeah, if you give a range of options, 14 would enable 4 stories though, wouldn't it? So you could get some quite some scale in terms of.
Okay, next up is Maryland's. So the bit that Kaingaora is seeking there that goes from general residential to local centre zone, it's a little bit pink at the bottom with the green around it. So I can understand the logic of why Kaingaora are seeking this. These sites are on a corner location and they're right next to existing local centre land. However, I do have some reservations. There's 5 townhouses on some quite small lots on the land that they're seeking to be rezoned, and they're reasonably intensively built. And there's 3 units on a cross lease and 2 units on 2 small freehold lots, and the houses are relatively new and they're well maintained, and I don't think that they're likely to transition to retail anytime soon. But I will keep an eye on what Campbell's doing in terms of his discussions with Kaingaora, and I'll factor that into my right of reply.
What's the road network like around there? Where are the main traffic flows? Do you know?
Main traffic flows are coming up Mangere Road,
Yeah.
which is the one coming from north to south, and then Cumberland Street.
Cumberland. Cumberland
So that area
goes down and up.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, quite flat where the centre is, but then it dips down quite rapidly around that Nevada Drive bit. And then finally, we've got Waitara, where Kaingaora are seeking that this block of 4 be rezoned as town centre zone instead of having medium density. So I have alluded to the fact that when we did our zone audits, that Waitara has considerable commercial land, and there's a lot of areas that are really underutilised and are ripe for development. And this includes commercial buildings that could be redeveloped, vacant space, the rear of commercial buildings, and large expanses of on-site car parking that could be repurposed. So the thinking behind having these sites as medium density is based on the fact that the edge of the Waitara CBD, there's been some redevelopment of the commercial land into town housing, and feedback from the Waitara Community Board has been that as a community they would like to see more land available for older people to live on flat land near the CBD. And this also aligns with the economic advice that we've had from Mr. Heath in terms of the amount of commercial land that we provide. So currently the sites contain a community hall, a church, and 2 dwellings. And the lots are actually quite large. They're about over 1,000 square metres each. And all 4 of these sites, 3 of the 4 are owned by the Taranaki Anglican Trust Board. So at this stage, I think our medium density is the most suitable zoning for the site, but I will touch base with Campbell in terms of what he thinks in terms of the wider medium density rezoning issues that we have going on.
What would the status of residential be in the local centre zone?
Beg your pardon?
In the local, TCZ, sorry. So,
What's the status of living or already committed?
Yeah.
What are the key standards there? That might trigger to another status. Are they bulk location, or are they activity, like does living have to be above ground level? Or
No,
it can be ground floor.
Yes, it can. Yes. Yeah. So, and town centre zone also has the design guide applying to it as well.
Yeah.
Because I made a change to that based on my recommendation.
24. See if Ryman's won't come down. Then you can.
Okay, so town centre zone was 12, and I've recommended that that be 14.
Lauren, you referenced the zone audits that that showed that there was lots of available commercial land, there was large car parking, areas that could be repurposed. They were undertaken around 2016, I think. Have you had the opportunity to go in and sort of retest that and ground truth it, whether it's still the situation in the town?
Not the zone audits as a whole, but I have visited last year with Michael Kelly in respect to heritage.
Right.
And because we were looking at this area in terms of whether it should be a heritage character area or not. So I did have a walk around. Yeah, and initial thoughts are it is quite a dire state. CBD.
So you stand by that comment about what the zoning orders show. If we revisit it, we find some of this. Thank you.
And that's the final one.
Thank you, Laura. Lauren, I mean.
That's all right, I've had Laura many times.
Right. Yes. So you mentioned some, so that's your reply, there's no other requests in this area? No. Thank you. Right, we're going to move to Todd for the fuzz and Airport Drive. Todd.
Well, thank you, Commissioners. So the first part of my right of reply will relate to, yes, the fuzz, and then also the submission that was heard in terms of the zoning request at Cowling Road to rezone some of that proposed fuzz zone to residential. In terms of the fuzz zone, and Louise has been helping with this work, so she may step in and provide some further commentary on this as well. Essentially, we have the submissions from Kāinga Ora to reduce the amount of fuzz within the proposed plan, and Kāinga Ora have a general concern that we have put too much emphasis on the fuzz as a means of providing for that long-term land supply. Obviously, we've heard from Campbell today that there is going to be quite a bit more work done in terms of the submissions from Kāinga Ora seeking changes to the amount of medium density residential zone that is provided. There's also been requests to revisit some of the performance standards within the other residential zones. And also we need to ensure that we include provision for residential units within the city centre zones as well. So that package of work has to be done. And then that's obviously going to result in a revised schedule table of the land which is available for short-term, medium-term and long-term land supply. So essentially that's just recapping, I guess, the process that's been set out. One of the other things that we will be waiting to see from Kāinga Ora is that the Commissioner specifically asked for them to come back with some commentary on the proposed policy fuzz P8, which was a policy recommended in the earlier hearing in regards to the release or provision for the rezoning and structured plan process for the fuzz areas. So that's something that we'll be looking to Kāinga Ora to provide, and then we can provide any further commentary on that as part of the written right of reply. There's obviously a lot of interrelationships between what's happening within our urban and in particular our residential zone provisions, and how that provides for that short-term, medium and contribution to long-term land supply, which needs to be, in my opinion, settled as much as possible. And then we can turn our minds to the fuzz areas in terms of the spatial extent and location. So I do see that we need to reach a point where we've got some clarity around those schedules of land supply in the first instance, and then we can provide some further advice in terms of the fuzz spatial extent. As we have heard, and as was discussed within the fuzz rezoning hearing, the only real ability to reduce the spatial extent of the fuzz comes from the Kāinga Ora submission. And if that fails to give scope, then I think there's going to be very limited grounds to consider actual reductions in the spatial extent. And again, I understand the commissioners have sought for Kāinga Ora to address that in the first instance, and then council can also provide some further commentary on scope. I don't believe we've actually seen anything from Kāinga Ora on the scope issue at this stage, at least I haven't seen it.
Only verbally, Todd.
Was that in your sights in terms of the matter on your schedule?
Yeah, so just to confirm, we haven't received any further written evidence or advice on the scope of that matter. So it may well be that we'll be prompting them.
Can you add that to the thing as I agree with Todd, that scope issue is pretty important when that comes to a sort of planning or a legal position, both. If you could make sure that we do get that as part of the overall inflation package.
There is one other fuzz where there is a submission that gives scope to remove it entirely, and that's the Ohakura South fuzz, isn't there?
Oh, that's correct. Yes. So there's direct submissions around the Ohakura fuzz. That's correct. So otherwise,
And Ohakura too.
In Oapururi, yeah.
oh right, yes, correct.
That's industrial, yeah, and it's a separate issue.
Can I ask you about that? I mean, even if there was scope, let's say hypothetically, the outcome of the Kāinga Ora submission is that we accept advice that, or we recommend that there be more intensification within the current city. Even if that increased the short and medium term supply, would we really want to go and start getting rid of the fuzz indicated land, provided we had a sufficiently robust policy barrier to some extent for it to be converted before we've made good gains in the short and medium term? I mean, isn't it about managing expectations for the future? And if is that a good way to do it?
Thank you, your Commissioner Little John. I was going to get to that because once we've settled on the scope issue to see, okay, whether we have scope or not, then we need to make a decision on the merits. And it's staff preference, and it's also my recommendation that if there was going to be a reduction in the spatial extent of the fuzz areas, then that is undertaken through the future development strategy process and not, I guess, as a fairly basic or simple response to, okay, we have heard evidence that we may have too much fuzz zone, and Smart Road is being identified as an area that could be reduced. But I consider that there would need to be a much more sophisticated level of analysis as to what areas should be reduced before any decision was made along those lines. For example, there may well need to be efficiencies of scale in terms of what the Smart Road fuzz does provide as a final land area catchment for urban development, given the infrastructure that will be needing to service that area. And I think also council would need to look at, or undertake a critical review of all the fuzz areas and make decisions as to whether there should be a reduction in areas across each of the fuzz areas, or should that reduction just come from one identified fuzz area. Because also I do want to, in my opinion, the oversupply of fuzz does not in itself provide an oversupply of urban land potential, given that it only safeguards that land for a future plan change and structure plan process. So I very much see that council needs to make its decision around the land supply and provision of the medium density residential zones for that short and medium, and also the contribution to the long-term land supply with those zone mechanisms that it already has in place. And then we turn our minds to the fuzz. And if we do have an oversupply, I think it would be quite reasonable to say, well, we're comfortable with that, because that's really just keeping the options open at this stage. And then council has accepted that there will be this review of those fuzz areas through the future development strategies. And I think that would be the appropriate time to do that. As I've said in evidence, I don't think council should be retaining the fuzz zones over areas unless there is a very real likelihood and pathway to future urbanisation of those areas, because there shouldn't be a fuzz zone for a fuzz sake unless there's actually a genuine need and identified pathway for that land to be urbanised at some point in the future. And that's going to be a number of plan cycles in advance of us. But I think if it's clearly identified that there's not a likelihood of future urbanisation of those fuzz areas, then they should be reduced once that assessment has been made. So I'm on your point, Commissioner Littlejohn, my view is that the commissioners can be quite comfortable reaching a conclusion that yes, there is an oversupply of fuzz, but that's not necessarily a bad outcome in terms of the current review process.
So just further to that commentary, and putting aside the Kaiangora position of whether there's scope or not, the only other reason for perhaps reducing the fuzz would be if there was a specific submission requesting that from the landowners involved.
Well, I think in terms of scope, so we've mentioned Arakuri and Arakura, so we've got submission points around that. With the Kaiangora submission, it appears that there's no set of plans actually showing what they were proposing as a reduced zone area. It appears that they've basically just identified the whole of the existing fuzz areas as matters for review or consideration, without actually showing what a reduced area would look like. So if the lack of those maps doesn't provide scope, then the commissioners would have to look to the general nature of the Kaiangora submission in terms of reducing those fuzz areas. And I think that starts to really bring into question issues of fairness and whether a party could reasonably understand or expect that their land was the land in question in terms of a reduced area of the fuzz zone. And I guess the only other scope would come potentially from Te Areawa and the other hapu submissions, where they have raised concerns about the fuzz zone in general, but on the basis that there are concerns about the, I guess, the consultation process, the amount of engagement that has been undertaken in terms of identifying and protecting cultural values and sites. So it would be the wrong mechanism, but obviously there's some opposition to those fuzz zones through some of those submissions, as I say, from Te Areawa and from hapu. And I'm not recommending that would give scope.
Oh, no, and just building on that, are the panel entitled to understand that the identification of the fuzz zones throughout the plan has been conducted in a fulsome manner, and that unless there's a recommendation in front of us to remove or modify the boundaries, then they're largely fit for purpose in terms of that holding indicative function, and giving support to UFD 14, I think it is, which sees fuzz taking up the slack in the medium to long term.
That's definitely my impression in terms of the involvement that I've had with the review process. I'm satisfied that council has been through a proper and due process in terms of identifying fuzz areas, and also obviously by including the fuzz zone as a planning tool or planning mechanism within the plan. And even going back to the fuzz hearings, there was no real issue in terms of the fuzz as an appropriate mechanism. So the issues that we had was were from iwi in terms of the protection and recognition of cultural sites, and then from Kaiangora in terms of the spatial extent. Kaiangora otherwise actually again support the fuzz zone as an appropriate tool and appropriate mechanism to be part of the district plan. And I consider that, as I say, council's been through an appropriate and due process in terms of bringing those fuzz zones through into the proposed plan.
Thank you.
So if there's no more questions on that,
Carry on, Todd.
oh, sorry. Yep.
I think we're done there, thanks, Todd.
So the next comment was in terms of the Cowling Road request, and that was to rezone some land from FUZ to residential. Now, through the hearings process and the evidence, we did have some useful assessment of the zone boundaries and the options for roading linkages and servicing of that land. However, I still have reservations in terms of how much weight can be given to that in terms of some key issues around providing for an additional extension of the residential zone, where there are issues around servicing and infrastructure. And I think the two key ones, which will probably come back and provide some more details in the written right of reply, relate to the roading infrastructure and also to wastewater. So currently, Cowling Road is quite a narrow, single lane, I'd say rural road. It's essentially servicing rural properties. And so I think that situation, if there's going to be an extension of the residential zone, it does really raise issues in terms of what is the interim solution in terms of roading infrastructure, whereby there would be normally an interim solution in terms of the upgrade required to service the small extension of the residential zone. But any future development of the FUZ may be 10, 15, 20 years away. And then you have this interim provision of roading infrastructure to service a small pocket of residential until such time as future decisions are made around the urbanisation of that land, at which time you would see the final solution in terms of that roading infrastructure. I have also been advised that while that subdivision consent that was mentioned in the evidence has basically been drafted and conditions issued to the applicant, the outstanding issue is actually the road widening conditions. And so at the moment there's a bit of a stalemate between council and the applicant as to what conditions will be appropriate for the servicing of that existing residential area. So as I say, we will provide a little bit more detail on this in the right of reply, but I just wanted to highlight that council staff and myself are not satisfied that those issues in terms of long-term infrastructure and servicing have been addressed. And the other issue is in relation to the wastewater. Now, again, there was some discussion on this and the evidence from Mr. Twigley. And he did actually note at paragraph 32, that there is an existing sewer main at Tahu Street, which is a bit further down from the subject site toward heading into town. And that was at sufficient depth and grade to achieve servicing of the residential lots, which they were seeking the rezoning for. But there's also a note that says however, the capacity of the downstream sewer network would need to be addressed to determine how many additional allotments could be accommodated. We've had some discussions with council's infrastructure team, and they very much highlighted that there is issues in terms of capacity in the wastewater network. And even with the subdivisions that have been granted within the existing subdivision or existing residential zone, it appears that that wastewater line is it's over capacity essentially. So I just want to highlight that we will be coming back with some further information and assessment of that in the written right of reply. There was quite a lot of discussion at the hearing in terms of an area of Franklin Road in terms of Crown to own land, and that may not be available for urbanisation. My response to that is that I do consider that's a little bit of a misnomer, in the sense that as part of any urbanisation of a FUZ zone, there will be areas set aside for reserves and walkways and pedestrian linkages. So it's obviously not contemplated that across any FUZ zone that you're going to have residential development across all parts of that FUZ area. So there will always be situations where part of that fuzz area is set aside for reserves and not for residential development. So I didn't really think that that was a strong part of the case in terms of saying that there should be a more favourable consideration of the area that they are currently putting forward. I also take the view that in terms of our land supply, I mean, obviously council is going to be doing some more work on that, but it does seem that we will be able to provide for the short, medium term land supply through existing residential zones and the other mixed use cities, centre zones as well. So there's no, I guess what I'm highlighting there is that I don't believe that the similar has really addressed those higher level or broader policy based issues in terms of whether or not there's actually a need for that land to be zoned residential now, as opposed to it being reserved for a future urbanisation process through the fuzz zone provisions. So essentially, I haven't heard evidence which would change my view in terms of the recommendation that the fuzz zone is retained for that area, and therefore the submission should be rejected. But as I say, we will be providing some further discussion on that in the written right of reply. If the commissioners also wish us to address any specific issues in terms of roading connections or potential residential boundaries, then it would be good to have that perhaps directed to us now so we can cover that off in the right of reply. There's
You've covered, Todd. But clearly we're getting some more advice on the Okura South fuzz and all those issues that Hamish is looking at in terms of roading and those sorts of things. But I think this Cowling Road one is the one that we've got enough understanding of in terms of what the submitters were saying. And certainly I agree with you on that offset argument that was trying to be run about that Crown land issue, but that's not a roading issue. So no, I don't have anything specific. No.
Before you got to the airport, I just wanted to have a very brief on Oraburu first.
Yes, thank you.
Yep. So nobody actually came and spoke to this, but in Te Atiawa's evidence, they questioned whether we had actually talked to Hapu about the final extent. And I just wanted to say that we're happy to have that discussion with them if you would want us to do that, just to confirm that we've got the exact extent of that par site and that Ruapa. And we'll report back on that in the final right reply.
So we'll do that, that'd be great, thanks. Right, Todd, so we're moving to Airport Drive now.
Thank you, Commissioners.
On your list.
Yes, Airport Drive. So I'm just going to go through some of the matters that were raised in the hearing for us to respond to. So the first one was whether the plan change 09 provided any further guidance in terms of the location of those local commercial centres. So I've gone back and I've reviewed the original section 32 report for that plan change and the Commissioner's decision. I haven't identified anything specific from the section 32 in terms of how those local centres were identified, but that may well be sitting in supporting documents, and I haven't had an opportunity, I haven't seen those, I've only reviewed the section 32. But I do note that the decision does address the location of those commercial areas, and that's actually was largely in response to requests for commercial rezonings of those sites, which included submissions from the Hibbles and other landowners through that process. Now, in the Commissioner's decision, all those submissions were rejected. So basically, there was no, so there were submissions seeking commercial rezoning or commercial zoning as part of the structure plan process, but they were rejected. And the reason that was given was that any commercial development should be considered at the subdivision and development stage, and that the plan change should not, and the words that was used was prejudge the outcome of future subdivision. So I found that a little bit curious in the sense that obviously zoning sets up the key plan provisions in terms of what uses is anticipated on any particular property. It does state, and I've got a paragraph reference here, 19.2, that the locations provided for those commercial centres, pink dots that we see on the structure plan, are considered to be the most appropriate. So there was a clear consideration of the location of those areas, but there's no further details given on that. And then the plan change, the structure plan provisions, they were amended from the notified provisions to include the additional clause that was spoken to in the hearing on Monday, which talks about those local centres and what they could be used for. But it also then has this funny reference to, well, the market will decide. So again, I don't find that particularly helpful. So as I say, I've revisited those decisions, and there's not, from what I've seen, much further guidance in terms of the location or proposed or the anticipated environmental results, land use activities within areas, other than what we've actually seen within the structure plan text itself. The next matter was from the chairperson. Commissioner, you requested a drawing of the Johnson property, the structure plan and the noise boundaries. I'm pleased to say that the council drafting people are very efficient. So we have prepared a plan, and hopefully that might be on your screens, or you might have some hard copies of that. Is Christine there? Or?
Yes, Christine's doing that for us, Todd. The standby should be with us, not too far away.
So I definitely can't take any credit for this, apart from asking the New Plymouth council staff to prepare the plan. And as I say, they've done a really great job in terms of being able to turn this around for us. The only qualification on it is that the advice that we had with the plan is it's definitely accurate. However, they would not want it to be used in terms of scaling of distances because it hasn't got that level of accuracy. I think they've overlaid plans on another plan to get the base map. So as I say, it's very much an accurate portrayal of the Johnson property, which you can see outlined in black, the existing and those proposed, or what the alternate noise contours may look like. And we've also have there the roading connections from the Area Q structure plan. And as you can see, the main Parklands Road extension does cut across the Johnson property in two locations. One just it clips the corner in the southwest corner of the Johnson property, and then it actually traverses the that extent that pops down into the centre part of the Area Q structure plan. So I guess I don't have further commentary on that, apart from we've been able to produce the plan for the commissioners, and we've also included the key there in terms of those noise contours.
Can you or someone thank the drawing team very much, because this is exactly what I wanted, Todd, and it's very, very helpful. Of course, these these rear line contours don't have any status. Anticipatory, but we have had evidence on these matters. But obviously, if that, my only comment is that 55 dB LDN line is important for protection of living environments. The airport's going to have quite a job in its future designation because those areas come into a lot of area Q and a lot of existing housing as well. That's what you even way up the map. So it's certainly a conundrum, I would have thought, for the airport. And but it does help us certainly in terms of Johnson's submission make some sense of things. They're clearly a key landowner in the whole future of Parklands Drive.
The only other comment I would make on that is that the Johnson were also part of the plan change process for Area Q, and there were requests for zoning of their land at that time for residential development, and that was declined by the commissioner when it was heard as the original plan change to the operative plan.
Yes.
Okay, so the next matter that we were asked to confirm was whether there had been any appeals on the Taranaki Regional Council discharge consent. And so I am able to confirm that TRC advised all the submitters on the 7th of June that the Environment Court did not receive any appeals against the decision of 11th of May, and therefore the decision essentially was confirmed. So TRC has actually confirmed that there were no appeals on that discharge consent. The fourth matter was whether or not there's been confirmation of the designation for Airport Drive. We'll need to come back to you on that one because we haven't been able to confirm that at this stage.
Todd, that must be well clear of any appeals by now, surely.
I think so too, yes.
Yes. It's just an administrative process now, the council including it in the district plan.
Isn't there, David, you're the expert on this, but there's 3 stages. There's our decision.
Yes.
There's a confirmation from the requiring authority accepting our decision.
Yes.
Then there's an appeal period.
Yes.
Then there's the administrative.
Yes, so it's just the last process that's now in place.
Okay, so what I was interested in is has the council actually confirmed our decision? Well, we made a decision, didn't we? That's right. So it's different. It's not a recommendation, it's a decision in this case. So you are right. Okay, well, just if there's no appeals, it's something we just need to have clarified.
Very similar to what's happened with Messenger recently, where it's been incorporated into the district plan as an administrative process. And I'm thinking that Airport Drive is in the same position. It's just that has not yet occurred, but it's a formality and that's not open to public input.
So I think the only thing we need to confirm then is that there's no appeals, and I'd assume there's not because of the time period would have elapsed for that.
Yes.
So we'll come back and confirm that. The next matter that the commissioners asked was for some feedback in terms of the timetable for the work on the structure plans, and I understand that there were some discussions on that with the hearing yesterday. All I can really say at this stage is that work has been progressed with Te Areawa, and we do have a working document now in terms of some changes which are being discussed. And I understand that Ms Edwards is actually going to report back to the commissioners in terms of the likely timetable for that deliverable in terms of the final right of reply for the structure plan work. So I think Ms Edwards is in the room.
Yes.
So
You,
yeah, So Miss Edwards might have some further update on that, but all I can say at this stage is that we will need to come back and confirm that, and some good work in progress has been made on that deliverable.
So my point was, if you were satisfied with what Ms. Marco said yesterday, then that's fine, but if you would like me to, I can come back with through Julie Strucker, a more timetable, an accurate timetable, so you have a record yourself. So
Yes.
it was just, if you'd like me to do that, I can.
I just know how important that work is for the plan,
Okay.
and the teams are working hugely hard on both sides. So if there was some relief that might assist, we could certainly look at that. But I think that Paula did produce a timetable
She has.
for working through that
Yes.
and reporting back.
Yeah, that's right. So I can give you an update on where they've got to
Yes,
and what they've established so far and work they're doing.
yes.
And Sarah Marco confirmed yesterday that she didn't think they needed any more time, but I'll double check that. I'll
Yes.
come back to you to confirm where things are at.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Sarah. So let's cover that off. Thank you.
Okay, so the next matter was there's a discussion around the progress on Parklands Drive. What I have been advised is that council did actually seek funding from the Government Infrastructure Acceleration Fund for capital works within Area Q, including the Parklands Drive extension. They were not successful with that funding application. And at this stage, they have not got any intentions to designate the road corridors within the structure plan. However, council is very keen to work with the landowners to try and ensure that there is a coordination in terms of the provision of infrastructure across Area Q. So I guess all I can say in response to that question is that at this stage, council doesn't have an intention to use its designation powers.
Okay. Thank you, Todd.
So then, just in terms of the right of reply, and I guess we can address this a little bit further in the written right of reply, with regard to the specific submissions for rezoning that we heard and were addressed in the hearing on Monday. There wasn't any new evidence produced in terms of the submissions for Area R. I have read the submissions from Sarah Marco, and essentially that was repeating or reiterating some of the concerns and issues that they've raised in previous hearings. But we didn't hear from the other parties, being the Plymouth Pistol Club and the Urban Dempster landowner, in terms of their rezoning requests. There was some questions from the commissioners in terms of the New Plymouth Pistol Club. I have been advised that there are some issues surrounding some complaints about the New Plymouth Pistol Club. So those issues of reverse sensitivity and the status of the club are matters that council is dealing with through other processes. So we didn't hear anything further from New Plymouth Pistol Club in terms of their submission to have the fuzz zone return back to a rural zone. So basically, there's no new evidence, and I'll retain my recommendation that the fuzz zone is retained for Area R. Next property obviously was the Hibble property at 47 Airport Drive. There was a good discussion around the retail modelling, and obviously the whole assessment of retail distribution effects and modelling is quite complex, and there does seem to be differences of opinion between the council expert and the applicant's expert. I think there was some acknowledgement from Mr. Heath that a smaller centre would have less issues than a larger centre. There was obviously a discussion around what does that mean in terms of adverse effects, because obviously the commissioners can't take into account trade competition. So then I guess it turns to whether or not there would be adverse effects on, for example, the Parklands shopping centre, which would affect the vitality of that, which would go beyond trade competition. I have not had experience where the planning issues have evolved around or revolved around the adverse effects on local shopping centres. So I cannot provide a lot of guidance to the commissioners on that. But clearly, obviously, trade competition is not a matter that is able to be considered, and it should not be part of the commissioner's decision or assessment of effects. In terms of traffic, the commissioners had the opportunity to hear from Megan Taylor this morning. I guess in my view, Megan is still raising some concerns in terms of potential traffic issues. And I'd have to say, it would have been very beneficial if the applicant had put forward some traffic evidence to align with what they were requesting in terms of the size of that area and the types of land use activities that may be considered there. And as I mentioned this morning, it's not just a matter of the rezoning, because the Hibbles have actually requested a change to the policy to specifically make provision for that access as part of any commercial zone. I guess it would be open for the commissioners, if you were comfortable with the rezoning, to say, okay, well, we'll accept the rezoning, but we don't want to tamper with the existing policy direction in terms of new access onto Airport Drive, and that would obviously set a higher threshold for any new access onto Airport Drive if the commercial zoning was there or not. It would retain the existing setting, which is essentially to avoid any new access as far as practicable. I am sympathetic to the submitter's request in the sense of they are obviously looking at their development options and are keen to promote some form of commercial development on their site, which is in accordance with the location of that local centre shown on the structure plan map. And I think providing certainty would be a good thing. I still also hold the view that it would be much preferable, or far more preferable for a decision around that zoning to be made in conjunction with a plan change to consider what the makeup of Area R was going to be. And however, again, we need to accept that that may not happen for some time. And are we going to hold up a decision now for a commercial zone for a local centre on the basis that it should be held off for another 10, 15 or 20 years? And that doesn't seem to be a great outcome either. I did note there was quite a bit of discussion around a service station, and one thing that occurred to me in hearing that evidence is that if there was going to be a service station, then I would have thought that that would be better located adjacent to the state highway, because then that would obviously provide a catchment for users of the state highway to use that as opposed to a service station which is off Airport Drive and essentially a more, I guess, locally focused service station. But I don't want that to be taken as retail distribution effects. It's just some other work that I've been involved with in Tauranga. There was definitely quite a bit of work done around the location of local shopping centres and whether or not they served the residential catchment, or if they were located closer to the highway network, then they picked up that passing motorist catchment as well. I don't like being in a situation where I'm sitting on the fence a little bit. again, I would prefer the decisions around any commercial zone to be made in conjunction with a plan change with Area R. Given that that's going to be some time off, I don't believe that there would be. I'm trying to think. What are the outcomes in terms of environmental effects by granting a commercial zone at this stage, and really there's probably not a lot against the submission request, again taking into account that it's would be basically giving effect to the structure plan provision, which actually does identify that as a commercial node or a commercial local centre. So I guess what I'm saying there is, if the commissioners were mindful to grant that rezoning request, I'm not going to be losing any sleep on it, to be fair. And I think the issue for the commissioners is the scale and scope of that commercial centre. I think there is the issue of the definition of that commercial zone as the original submissions was set out, and what is now being proposed through the evidence. It is a twofold increase in the area, and while in some cases you may take the view, well, that's not a significant increase, I guess there is concerns both from the council retail expert and from the traffic expert that there are potential issues in relation to those matters which are outstanding. So obviously that would probably support more of a smaller scale rezoning proposal than a larger scale rezoning proposal.
Todd, what I think would be useful in your reply would be to take or give us some advice about, or note those residual concerns, but if we were minded to provide some form of commercial zoning there, given both the scope aspect of what was sought in the original submission and the best sort of shape of a zoning pattern, that would be helpful, just because the zone patterns is important in relation to those aspects, or particularly the traffic aspect we talked about this morning.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes, we can do that.
Yes, I think that would be useful. Just stepping back a little bit, your comment about not having much involvement in the trade competition and how that might relate to adverse effects on sort of whole shopping centres. Unfortunately, I have had a reasonable amount of experience in that space. I think it was quite a key High Court decision, Coastlands and Parapara Umu, which was seeking that they be considered adverse effects on the whole shopping centre and not trade competitors, and I think they got turfed out probably 2 or 3 years ago. It might have been a Judge Dwyer decision, but I think there might have been a High Court judicial review taken on the question of trade competition as well. So you might dig around amongst the decisions and see whether you can find anything around Coastlands.
Yes, thanks for that, Commissioner. I'll definitely be keen to have a look at that. Okay, so that brings us to the last rezoning request, which was for the Johnson property, and we've already had that up on the map. Again, as per the evidence in the discussion in the hearing on Monday, I think the most pressing issue for that rezoning request is the interface with New Plymouth Airport. I guess both in terms of the existing noise contours and what is an appropriate zone around any provincial city airport. Often rural zone provisions are provided where they can be retained around provincial airports. It's not quite the same, obviously, within larger metropolitan areas. And I guess in terms of the evidence that we heard, there was some discussion around it being a viable farm. I think that's always difficult to really place a lot of weight on, and even in the discussion from the hearing on Monday, there's obviously opportunities for lease blocks to be managed as part of a larger farming operation, and there may be other people who have less concerns with regards to the dairy use as a viable use for a economic unit, as opposed to being some form of lifestyle. So I think that argument doesn't get very far in terms of supporting a rezoning to residential. I think definitely we can have some sympathy in terms of losing land through the structure plan process to the south, and now obviously Ms Johnson is also being approached by council for further land to the north in terms of the walkway. But as I say, I don't think that is a strong argument in terms of justifying a rezoning to residential. I think also, and we've had a lot of discussion through the hearings in terms of engagement with Puketapu in and around the Area Q structure plan, and again, I think if there was going to be any decision to provide for a residential zone on any part of that Johnson property, that there would need to be evidence produced that that was going to be acceptable to Puketapu, or at least that Puketapu had been consulted and engaged and were comfortable with a new residential area or boundary. So essentially, I don't believe that there is sufficient evidence to support a rezoning of that property in part or in whole to a residential zone. There was some discussion around a rural lifestyle zone. And it may be easier to consider that, but I think the problem we have there is that we don't have a firm proposal from the submitter in terms of what that area of rural lifestyle would look like and how many house sites that could accommodate and where they'd be located in terms of the existing or potential future air noise boundary. So again, there's a lack of evidence there to support that proposal as well. So again, my recommendation is that the rural zone be retained, and I haven't actually been able to, I haven't heard additional evidence which would change me to a different position or recommendation on that.
Todd, how much of any evidence we've had about this future potential runway alignment can we take account of? There's nothing we can have a go on that this is a possibility. There's still a master plan that's got to be confirmed.
In my view, apart from acknowledging that evidence has come forward from New Plymouth Airport that they are currently having to undertake an exercise to look at future options for an alternate runway alignment, there's no way that you can really provide to that. As I say, apart from recognising that in the context of this area, we have received evidence from the airport that's what they're needing to do. I do also think that obviously with the airport being recognised as regionally significant, and I think also nationally significant infrastructure. I was just looking at the provisions in the NPS. So any airport used for regular air transport services is also identified as nationally significant infrastructure under the NPS. So I think on that basis, it is appropriate to take a precautionary approach. So I guess that does perhaps give you some license to consider and acknowledge the evidence from the airport. Obviously, and they've accepted that there would need to be a full plan change process to consider any alignment or change in the alignment to the runway and the effects of those changes to the noise contours and the obstacle limitation services. And that, as you know, as we've just would be a significant planning process.
My only other thoughts at the moment that you might want to respond to are when you look at the portion of the Johnson property 115 Airport Drive that's actually within Area Q, there's quite a reasonable chunk already in there, isn't there?
In terms of the Johnson property?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. There is quite, as you say, quite a chunk of their property is part of the Area Q. I guess what they are subject to is, there's the Parklands Road extension, and then there's another that may be a collector road which goes along their boundary, and then there's two other local connections. So their property is actually subject to a number of those road corridors.
We've also heard they're only indicative and it's a restricted discretionary activity to ignore them. So I guess that's for them.
Yes.
I was going to ask, and it sort of comes, it's the question that I've sort of talked to Louise about in the context of one of the properties out at Egmont Village, about the situation under the subdivision rules where you've got a split zone property that has a rural production zone, but it then has another zone identified on the same parent title that has a lower minimum lot size, and how that is potentially dealt with through the subdivision provisions. Because it seems to me the logical future here. No one can force the Johnsons to develop their land, and no one can force them to sell them their land unless it's by way of designation. So it seems to me the logical future here is that they are approached by someone to purchase that portion of the land that's within Area Q, and then a subdivision consent process would follow. And I guess I'm interested to know whether that would be assessed as a rural subdivision with and be non-complying because it didn't have a minimum lot size of 20 hectares, although I assume, I'm just guessing, the block of that land looks like it is bigger than 20 hectares anyway. But it's the same issue about that split zone issue. How is a subdivision assessed when you've got two different densities, but on the same parent title?
Mm.
Do you want me to answer that, Todd, or can you answer that?
Louise is offering to answer that.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to pass over to Louise. I just would have thought from a pragmatic perspective, it shouldn't be a problem because obviously it's just giving effect to the different zone provisions and acknowledging that there is a split zone. But happy for Louise to step in.
Yes, so you would look at each zone separately. You would look at the rural, the residential subdivision provisions. And if they meet that, obviously it'd be controlled subdivision. Yeah. And then you would look at the rural portion of the land as the rural subdivisions. And if they can meet the minimum balance lot, I think it's I have to check the activity status,
Yeah.
discretionary or restricted, it would be that activity status, and then you would combine, you'd have an overall combined activities status for the subdivision.
The subdivision is defined on the site, isn't it?
Yes,
Which is
yes, so
cadastral.
it would look at, but it would have to look at the portion of the rules that apply to the bit that was zoned res and the bit that was zoned. And you'd have to meet the rules of each bit, and then you could combine it together to get an overall activity status. So whichever is the, if it's disc, there's a higher one, it would overall would become an disc.
Yeah.
Or, I'm not sure the lot sizes here to know whether it,
Just
they can meet the
thinking
balance lot.
There is case law which supports that, which says that we've got a bundled application, but the bundling occurs because of two different propositions. You're not comparing, for example, you wouldn't assess for the purposes of 104D, for example, you wouldn't assess the residential portion subdivision against the rural zone policies.
Correct, you've got to treat them separately.
So even though you'd have an overall status, you'd be segregating the policies that dealt with each.
Correct.
Okay, so in that sense, there's a pathway there.
Yes, there is a pathway for it.
That's why I was interested. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Todd. I didn't have anything else to talk about.
Todd, the only other question I had, where I think the Johnsons got to, when we're talking about this plan you've produced, is that area of land between the northern structure plan road, which just hugs the boundary of area Q. It's certainly not a very efficient way of developing a residential area to have a road with only being able to access housing on one side.
Yeah.
Might there be any potential to, add in some additional residential zoning on the other side of that road, outside of the area Q? Just so that would be a more efficient development pattern?
Well, I think that's within the scope of their submission, yes. As I say, it's just, we don't actually have a clear proposal from them to assess. I mean, there was obviously.
I think we do have a clear proposal that they're seeking residential zoning. What you're saying is they don't have a clear structure plan. They've sought residential zoning over the whole piece of land, haven't they?
That's correct.
Yes.
I guess my view is that we're still then providing additional residential zoning in close proximity to New Plymouth Airport, and I given that we are not having to look to this area for additional residential zonings to meet any land supply requirements, then I don't believe it's the best location to have a new residential zone. I do accept, as you've said, that having this roading link right on the boundary of the structure plan area does seem to be not the most efficient way of developing the structure plan, but I think that alignment was chosen to avoid the house site locations, which are just to the south of that alignment. So they've had to go to the Johnson property to the north and not come through at a lower level than that.
Yeah, I think that looks to be included in the area so that the block of the Johnson land that is within area Q can get access to Airport Drive. So that's because it doesn't have any other, well, yeah.
Becomes a sort of an urban rural edge then, doesn't it, to some extent?
Yeah.
Even though it's not very efficient, but it probably serves other purposes. But the person who ends up with that block could alter the layout of that at any.
Yes, they could. Yeah. All right, so I think we're finished questioning on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Well done. It's good. David, how are you going time? Need to leave around 3.
We did want to catch up with Sarah quickly. Louise, you're up for the third leg of the treble, or your treble,
Yeah.
I think. Yes.
Okay, so the rural rezoning requests. I'll just go through what I want to talk about, and then should I just pause if you've got questions on each one? Okay, so 31 Eva Road is the first one. Mr. McCoy wanted to rezone this from rural production to rural lifestyle. Just wanted to say a few points. I agree that this piece of land is a smaller rural production size piece of land due to historic subdivision patterns, and it may not be suitable for primary production, traditional rural production activities. However, just because it's zoned rural production does not mean that the land must be used for primary production activities such as farming. And this situation applies to a large number of our small lot rural land holdings throughout the district. And this alone is not enough of a reason to rezone all these pieces to rural lifestyle, and retaining this rural production zoning on small lot rural lands can help us contain our urban boundary and provide a compact urban form. In terms of access, I also note that there are many examples in the district where rural land beyond the urban limits is accessed via urban areas, and I do not consider that these properties along Eva Road are unique in this regard. Nevertheless, the submitter did make some good points, and the following will need to be weighed up and considered for my written reply. The extra yield if this land was to be rezoned to rural lifestyle and the impact of this. I also look at the subdivision resource consent for this property, and need to consider where is the most appropriate boundary of the wider rural lifestyle area.
You?
22B, St. Ives Grove. Mr. Moore was seeking to rezone this property from rural production to general residential. At the hearing, he described where potential building platforms could be located and how they could be accessed. Ms. Edwards confirmed that consent would be required under the transport tractor or access off the state highway. I can also confirm that as part of the district plan review, this area was discussed in relation to access with Waka Katahi, and they indicated that they would not approve access to develop this land off the limited access state highway. Harab Investments, the 2 Johnson Street, Waitara. So I will meet with Catherine Hooper and Sarah Marco to discuss the wording of the provisions, where the matters are still in contention, and I will report back in the written reply on that.
Thank you.
Okay, Owakura rezoning request. So as notified, 43 Donnelly Street contains a split zoning, general res and rural lifestyle zone. And Tanya Hansen thinks that this entire site is rezoned general residential. As outlined in the section 42A report, there are several reasons why I do not recommend that this land is rezoned to general residential, including topographical and infrastructure constraints, and that the portion of the land at 43 Donnelly Street that is zoned rural lifestyle links into the wider Surrey Hill Road rural lifestyle area, which other landowners have, neighbouring landowners have the bottom portions of their property zoned rural lifestyle also. I would just briefly like to revisit the natural hazard concern in relation to flooding risk for 43 Donnelly Street, Owakura, that was raised in evidence by the submitter in the hearing. They, in the hearing, stated that the river flats at the bottom are prone to flooding. In the hearing, I stated that if this land was zoned residential, council would consider these flooding issues at the time of subdivision. My statement was based on the observation that no flooding areas are shown on the planning maps or the non-district plan stormwater flooding area layer, and the subdivision provisions require that a stable flood-free building platform is provided. In addition, all subdivision proposals must be assessed under the RMA section 106, which must consider natural hazard risks and may decline or impose conditions in relation to this. However, since the hearing, I've discussed these flooding matters with Council's Three Waters planning team, who have advised that the stormwater flooding area, the non-district plan layer that is shown on the planning maps, has not been applied in this location. At the time the mapping was undertaken, the scope of this study was limited to land zone residential in the operative district plan. Therefore, this portion of Donnelly Street, which would have been zoned rural at the time, has never been assessed for flooding hazard or flooding risk. I just would like to refer to, as outlined in evidence of Mr. Mark James in key issue 3 of Ms. S section 42A report for hearing 7, natural hazards. The council is undertaking a significant stormwater modelling project over a 10-year period, which has already been funded in the long-term plan to model all the catchments to the standard that has been already modelled for Waitara. MPDC has not yet done any stormwater planning or hydraulic modelling for the Okura River, but will be undertaking stormwater planning for Okura in the future. There is no active flood management, for example, stop banks on the Okura River. Stormwater and river flooding hazards are anticipated to be exacerbated by climate change. In my view, now rezoning the land for residential development may be inconsistent with the objectives of the natural hazards in the subdivision chapters, as well as council's responsibilities under the RMA section 6, 7 and 31. The advice I've been given is that without this flooding work undertaken, it is hard to ascertain the extent of how much of this low-lying land beside the river would be undevelopable due to the flooding risk. While the flooding concerns could be dealt with at the time of subdivision, I now have concerns about the expectations that this would create if the land was rezoned to residential, and therefore I am going to stick with my original recommendation that this land should be retained as rural lifestyle.
Thank you, Louise. And that's why I asked the questions of these matter about whether they'd done that work and they hadn't. You know, I was surprised that with a river like this, there wasn't that flooding information map, but you explain that. Can I just, like, I know you're zooming through. I wonder whether we just take break now.
Yeah.
We talk with Sarah and Denise briefly while David's still here, because there's a key issue around view shafts and heights and things. And then we come back to you. So let's adjourn this hearing until at least 3 o'clock. Let us have that quick discussion with Sarah and Denise about this break-up hearing, and then we'll come back to you. That's okay.
Unmute.
No. Yeah, oh, okay. I had unmuted the room, so that like me. Ah, it was muted before though.
Okay, cool. So I'll move on to Egmont Village, the Olsen Street rezoning request. So a question was raised in the hearing on Tuesday when I wasn't here of Sarah about the yields for Egmont Village and rural lifestyle. So it is covered in the section 42A report on between paragraphs 69 to 75. But just briefly, I'll just go over it. Olsen Street. So the overall yield for the Egmont Village lifestyle area is it could have 13 10-hectare lots and 24 1-hectare lots. I was just going to, which we've probably partly covered with Todd in the airport about the split zoning and the subdivision, because Kit, you asked the other day about whether there was a pathway for this property in terms of subdivision. This one is a little bit more complex because neither lot, the rural lot nor the rural production, can, if they were to be subdivided, meet the balance lot requirements. So it would become non-complying in the rural section and the rural lifestyle, because for argument's sake, the rural lifestyle can't use the rural production as the balance lot. So this would be a non-complying subdivision, but there is a pathway to go through it. I guess this portion of the Olsen's property that's in rural lifestyle, being that 1 hectare approximately, it's going to be non-compliant if they want to subdivide that down further, because it doesn't meet the, it doesn't have the balance lot. And I guess I just wanted to also say that this is not the only piece of rural lifestyle land that's like that. You know, the rural lifestyle zone is not intended for large scale development. So some of them are smaller lots without easy development potential. In regards to Ms. Busby's evidence, she provides some really fulsome evidence, and I will need some time to consider this evidence and that of Mr. Walker's, and need to consider how much extra rural lifestyle yield this, if we were to rezone the whole land, would provide, and whether this is appropriate. And I will report back on this in my written right reply. If we go to Leperton now, if you just type 19 Old Road. So here we received submissions on 19 and 20 Old Road and 552 Richmond Road, Leperton, from rural production to low density residential. A question was raised, I think it was Commissioner Littlejohn, on the demand for dwellings in Leperton. So we've had a look back at building consent data between 2013 and 2020. And on average, there's been 12 building consent applications per year for new dwellings in Leperton. It dipped a little bit in 2015 where there was only 5, and there was a peak in 16 and 17 where there was 19 applications, which sort of coincides with the timing of that Smith Street subdivision consent, because that was about 2017. Another question here that was raised was relating to the breakdown of, I've said that the dwellings available, there was 27 dwelling yields available, and the question was around Leperton North, Leperton South, and what made the what properties made up that 27. So I can clarify that the Leperton North area, which we said had about 7 dwellings, this is made up of the church land. We've estimated the church land's got probably somewhere between 2 to 4 dwellings, 4 potential if the church was removed, the sort of 2, maybe 3 if the church wasn't removed. The other makeup of this Leperton North is the Alpha Road training facility. If that was to be removed and rezoned, there would be a
popular welding. You're going to learn to weld.
as a welding training facility. Yeah. So if that was to close, there would be a potential for sort of another 2 to 3 there. And the other makeup here is there is 2 sections on Cross Street that they've already got a dwelling on, but they're allowed enough to be subdivided in half.
Okay.
And the Leperton South, the makeup and the calculations was 20 dwellings. I just wanted to clarify here, this relates to 11 and 15 Old Road. This here would be anywhere between 17 to 20 dwellings. The 20 dwellings would be if we subdivided, if anyone subdivided down to 750 metres squares. The 17 would be if it was 800 square metres like section sizes. I have had a brief look into whether or not the church is still operating. I have managed to find out that there was a church service in December, but it looked like that was kind of just maybe a unique bespoke sort of service around Christmas time. So I need to do a bit more investigating to find out if it's fully operational, but from what I can see, it appears it's not.
Louise, I know somebody wants to buy a church and move it, so it's closed.
Do you want to put it on your vineyard?
No, my friend who runs Cape Sanctuary,
No, he wants a church.
Ocean Beach, wants a church down there.
What's it like? What's this one like?
I'll be on the
I'm
lookout
not
for a
sure.
church.
I've not been in. It's quite full, but I've not been inside it. So I think what I've
Louise is going to move to Lepton, and she's going to wait every night patiently for a service.
I'll see if I can find a contact phone number and find some more details. But what I've been able to find sort of aligns with what the submitter was saying, that it's partially in operation.
Right.
But yeah, I'll confirm that in the written right of reply. I'll also provide more detail on Lepton's dwelling yield and what sort of growth levels might be considered appropriate for Lepton. There was a question that was asked by Commissioner Dash around information in regards to complaints of poultry activity in the area. So I've started the ball rolling on this, and I've talked to our compliance team, and they're going to dig up some information. And I'll also talk to TRC to see what information they've got on complaints around the chicken sheds and respond in my right of reply. And then there's also the further bit of work that I mentioned in the overview in regards to septic tanks and servicing of dwellings, which will feed into this right of reply, and we'll respond further to that in the right of reply. And then finally, Pukeiti. I would like to thank Hapu and Iwi for the evidence. It was very clear and helpful. And I would like to consider these matters further and report back in the written right of reply on my recommended rezoning for Pukeiti, taking into consideration the following. The most appropriate zoning for the activities currently undertaken at Pukeiti after taking a comparison of the provisions for rural production, open space zone versus natural open space zoning. Also need to balance the tangata whenua concerns around protection of the land they would like to see identified as the SNA. And I will work with TRC, iwi and Hapu to consider whether a split zoning of maybe open space and natural open space might be more appropriate, and whether the natural open space zone has the potential to provide protect that land that they would like to see as SNA.
So we've yet to make a decision on the SNA's status of PP from hearing 5, so that's all front of us.
Yeah.
Okay, so on Lower Kaipakari Road and Paki Street, the Renui, no change, no thinking about those?
Those are Campbell's ones, but
sorry.
Just one moment, he did send me his notes. I don't believe there's any change, but just one moment. He hasn't given an overall position. If there's any specific questions, I can take them back to him. Otherwise, he will report back on that one and Settlers Bush, his recommendations in the written right reply.
Louise,
That's
your
me.
voice last.
Just made it.
Okay.
Another one down.
Ryan, you're not sitting there ready to tell us anything else?
No, just.
Board,
No,
missing us already.
it's interesting. I'm actually quite enjoying the rezoning hearings because we've done all of the provisional work earlier, all of that horizontal and vertical integration stuff, and this is just about basically the colour that we put on the lot.
Yes.
And I'm finding it quite interesting.
It's worked really well for us. And I think the timetable of this rezoning here in the spot Yes, thank you. So I think we'll just close the hearing, and we'll be reconvening on Monday at 9 o'clock to deal with the Blue Haven and the Pro-Devon matters. Tuesday. Is it?
Pro-Devon on the afternoon.
Pro-Devon, Tuesday. Yes, thank you. So,
Christie.
Dr.